Welcome everybody to another live developer interview here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. My guest tonight, he is the lead designer behind the game Perception, as well as having previous credits at Irrational Games. Please welcome Bill Gardner.
Hey,
Hey
how's it
Bill,
going?
it's great to talk to you again. How are you doing?
Doing great. Just busy. We came out of the Switch since we last talked. So been busy with that. And hold on, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I apologize.
That's alright.
Oh, I know what it is. Jesus, not getting feedback at all. I have the YouTube channel open. So sorry.
I know, I've done that in the past too.
Okay, there we go. Sorry. I'm such a noob. So yeah, Switch version came out. Been a lot of great feedback there, a lot of great enthusiasm, good reviews. We got a couple of nominations for various Game of the Award, Game of the Year awards. Whoa, lights are possessed here. And so it's been good. Keeping busy, but going good.
Yep, congrats on the Game of the Year nom there.
Thank you.
And I know with the Switch, I was reading the news about that on Twitter as well. I'm not sure
Nice.
we talked about this last time, but what do you think about the Nintendo Switch and like what it's been offering?
Oh man, I am in love. I'm very biased because I've always been a huge Nintendo fan. I wrote a little article after we launched on the Switch just about what it means to me to be on a Nintendo console because I've been making games for I don't know, what about 16, 17 years now, and I've always wanted to be on a Nintendo system, but the stars never aligned, right? It's like working on BioShock or SWAT or whatever it is. It just wasn't meant to happen in terms of right project, right platforms, that sort of thing. So when we were getting relatively close to wrapping on Perception, I had contacted Nintendo because I knew they were planning something. I know they were planning it. This is before they had announced the Switch, and again, my goal was always to get on one of their systems. And so we had some talks already in process, and so I was lucky enough to get kits early and all of that, and I was going to do everything I could to get on the console there. And so as a platform, I think it's absolutely spectacular. I think that it's pretty easy to develop for. I think it has a lot of really amazing features, but more importantly, and I think the headline really should be that it really does change the way you play games. I think that as a developer and a father of four, and all the things that I have going on in my life, I don't have a ton of spare time. But with the Switch, you find time to game. Whether it's I'm building something in the game and waiting for my computer, or if I'm on an errand, or watching my kids, during a hockey practice or something like that, I'm finding time to game. And so I've sort of reclaimed a lot of, I don't want to say wasted time, but waiting time. And
Yeah.
so it is a spectacular platform in every regard. Even when and then the whole just it's what they sell it on, but just connecting it to the TV just instantly, and it's just it really has changed games the same way they changed games when they went wireless. When they invented when they created the Wavebird, it was like all of a sudden everyone's like, of course we need wireless controllers. What are we doing? So it's spectacular, and I'm so excited to be on the Switch.
Awesome. Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how the Switch will eventually wrap up in terms of success, especially after the Wii U kind of just fizzled out there by the end. But this year has certainly been a outstanding year for Nintendo between
Yep.
Breath of the
Yep.
Wild, Mario Odyssey, and probably other games which I have yet to actually play. And I like the mood lane getting red there, just as we were talking.
I
Perfect.
don't know what it is. They're kind of at that time I said it myself, but yes, because this is my little hovel where I do all my development. I spent the money to give myself a couple of these lights just to help with the mood. And yeah, it kind of have a mind of their own occasionally, where one of them will set off. But that time I was like, okay, I got to get them in sync. It's gonna make for a very romantic podcast.
I think we just found my new Patreon goal for next month. I think that's what we need here. Just that'll be perfect for our live show. Just have the
Yep.
lights going in different colors as we're talking. Oh
Absolutely.
boy, so we certainly have a lot to talk about tonight. We're going to be discussing horror design and kind of how the genre has grown, what you've seen from your end, especially developing Perception, and
Sure.
as well as just what it means to scare people, and I guess the right and wrong ways of freaking people out. But
Sure.
to begin with, for people who didn't see our previous podcast, could you talk a little bit about your background when it comes to the game
Sure.
industry, Bill?
Absolutely. So I've been making games for, geez, I don't know, like I said, 16 years. I got to do some math here. But anyway, I got my start fresh out of college. I went to film school and realized that I would rather make games. I had always that was always my life passion. I love film, but games was really my thing. And up until you know when I was about to graduate, games were almost entirely made in Japan. And so you started to see this resurgence with Western development, companies like Blizzard and Naughty Dog, and with the release of things like the PlayStation and the PC gaming absolutely taking off, you started to see more and more Western dev. And I realized that I could actually make games, and that goofy article I mentioned about the Nintendo or being on a Nintendo system. I talked about how when I was, 9 years old, I sent in design docs to Nintendo for Metroid 2 and Indiana Jones and all these games that I was hoping would get made. So I was always into it. I was always like, people talk about being obsessed with games, but I always felt like I took it to a whole new level where, I would go to people's houses and take notes about how they played and try and figure out how I would design the dungeon. And I would sit there and talk to people like, what if instead of fighting this boss here, you fought him here, and talked about the way, just design the level sort of on the fly, and then go home and draw maps out and that sort of thing. So, I flash forward to I happened to meet Ken Levine, and he offered me a position in QA at Irrational. He was the creative director and founder at Irrational, and I worked my way through QA to design and did all kinds of production work, and eventually up to lead level designer and design director, and worked on BioShock and BioShock Infinite and all that. And then after Irrational, I started the Deep End Games, where I wanted to create something that's different. I wanted, like, one of the goals that I had was to create games where when you pitch them to people, their initial reaction is like, "Wait, what do you mean? I don't get it. It sounds a little bit crazy." And then something clicks, and they're like, "Oh, wait a minute." And so the idea of playing a spooky or horror game where you're playing as a blind person, initially people are like, what? And then it's something like, oh, wait a minute, yeah, I get that. That's awesome. That's cool. That's what I always want to do. I want to create high concept games that hook people in, and then try and take it to the next level with a narrative and an atmosphere that really immerses people and that gets people talking beyond the experience. And so Perception, our first release, just came out, like I said. It was on PS4 and PC, Xbox One, and more recently Switch. And so, yeah, I've been cranking away at that and really, really psyched.
Awesome. And on our last cast, I know we talked a little bit about BioShock and the general design for that. I remember we talked about how the control scheme was different, and that's one of those things that I thought was very interesting. And what you just described about sending in like design document ideas to Nintendo, I remember one time I pitched for Access an idea for a real-time
Nice.
strategy game.
Nice.
And now
That's
that I
awesome.
think about it, it sounds very familiar to Rise of Nations. So I don't know.
Oh, wow.
Maybe maybe Brian Reynolds saw that email and decided
That's
to do
funny.
something there.
Um, that is too funny. Yeah, it's tough because the response that I got from Nintendo was like, well, the first letter I got said, "Hey, you'll be excited to know that the game you pitched us, Indiana Jones, is being made by Mindscape, right?" And what that meant was, coincidentally, your idea is something that happens to be already being in the works by this other company. But I read that as, "We like your idea and we're going to make it." And so then, like, being 10 years old, I didn't know any the legalese and all that sort of stuff. But then, so I kept sending them more and more letters and more and more design docs and sketches and that sort of thing. And eventually they caught on. They're like, "Oh, wait a minute, we can't take unsolicited ideas." And so the next letters were very different. They're like, "Hey, just so you know, we're sending you back your ideas. We can't hang on to them legally, and while we appreciate them, we can't accept unsolicited ideas." But anyway, that didn't deter me. I kept crafting things, and geez, man, I'll tell you, if Minecraft existed when I was a kid, I think my career path would have taken a very different arc. um, these kids today have it so easy. But anyway, so well, geez, tangents. As you know, I tend to ramble. What was the question?
I don't think we got to a question yet either.
Okay, cool, cool.
But it looks like we did get one from chat. Oscar is asking, did you have to make any adjustments for perception on the Switch, or like add anything unique for the game when you brought it over?
So Nintendo is very supportive in terms of they want to make sure that you maintain your vision and that you're creating what you want to create. Nintendo's great, a great partner, and they made some suggestions about like what about motion controls and all that. And frankly, we didn't really have the resources to do stuff really fancy stuff with the Joy-Con. Although at some point, if it continues to do well, maybe that's something I'll consider. No promises, but so in terms of the hardware, it's a beast. It's a real powerful machine. Obviously it's not going to be as powerful as the Xbox One X, but we really didn't have to do very many compromises at all. I mean, you think about when you were playing the unit in handheld mode, you're gonna have to lower the resolution because your eye's not gonna be able to detect ridiculous. You look at your phones, you look at iPads, you look at all this sort of stuff. You can't detect resolutions at below a certain point, and frankly, it'd be too hard to see. And so you make little tweaks to suit the platform, to make sure that it's gonna perform best and look best. And so for us, it was really mostly a matter of just making sure we're making it look as good as possible on a unique platform, and then also considering things like the fact that you're going to be taking this thing on the go. I'm sure you saw some of the stats where I can't remember what it was. I think it's something like 60+% of people play it in handheld mode rather than TV. And so you have to consider those things and make a couple adjustments based on that to try and accommodate. But overall, it's funny because Nintendo has quite a few less, if I can say, red tape requirements. You think about Sony and you think of Microsoft, there's achievements and there's all kinds of rules about when you unplug the controller, you have to display this very specific text. And so it's very particular in that regard. But Nintendo, to me, seemed a lot more thorough in terms of their quality testing to make sure that this part doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in the text, and really subjective testing, which was cool. I think that it speaks to their brand of quality, where they really only release really fantastically tested, vetted titles. Anyway, so overall, it's a great platform to work on. Really, really powerful, and man, oh man, is it exciting to get it out there when there's so much heat on the system, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to see how much things have really changed regarding independent games on Nintendo console. Because I remember hearing a lot of horror stories from developers, I think during the Wii era, with trying to get their games ported over either due to restrictions or content issues as well. And we've really been seeing a lot more from Nintendo, or at least a lot more from the Switch, with being welcoming to indies. I think I heard the N is Nigh got on the Switch, and I think a few others as well.
Well, Nintendo really, I think it's been going on for years now. You look at the Nindies initiative, the program that they have to really support Nintendo indies. And I think you're starting to see those chickens come home to roost now, where, man, oh man, I think it's probably the hottest indie system, besides PC, obviously, because there's no barriers to entry at all. I think it's the hottest system out there for indies. I think it's for everyone, honestly. There's definitely a gold rush going on right now, and I think that will absolutely continue, given just the general excitement, but also the value that's there. The idea, I genuinely mean it when I say it changes the way you play games. The way that there's little things that I think make a huge impact. The way that they allow you to customize the way you play. The fact that I can play it with the standard Joy-Con connected controller. I can separate the Joy-Cons and play it's a silly thing. And I know that the Wii sometimes gets a little bit of flack for the wild controls, but I genuinely love the fact. I'm a big UX guy. I got my master's in it, right? And I love being able to lie down on my couch and not have to hold my controller like this, you know? The fact that I can like actually play like I'm playing like this sometimes. You know, like lounging on my couch. It takes lounging on the couch to a whole new level. So, but I mean, like these are little things that I think speak to the changing the way you play. You take that further and you talk about the way it's just like you pick it up and you go, right? Like honestly, I love every platform. I love the PlayStation. I love the Xbox. I love Steam, but particularly with the consoles now, it's become a bit of a hassle to play. And I think like the sort of barriers to entry every time you sit down and like again time's limited. I'm very sensitive to this because I do not have a lot of time to play. I mean, if it were up to me, I'd play games all day, and I used to. I just don't have that time now. I'm making games and I'm with my family and all this sort of thing. But the idea of starting up getting a new game, and what I usually do is I'll get a new game, and whether it's download or put in the disc or whatever, and then you got to wait for the updates, you got to wait for it to install, and then there's a system update, and then your controller's dead, and like your connectivity's down, and like on and on and on, all these different barriers to entry. I have never had a problem with my Switch. I sit down and I say it's time to play, or I just like I haven't played it in a couple days. I take it to go and I'm playing on the road, whatever it is. It's the sort of thing Nintendo has always like. They've gotten a lot of flack in the past for like, oh, they don't have online, they don't have this, that, the other thing, and that's frustrating, and that's a problem in some ways. But I think the benefit right now is greatly outweighing all of the things that some people gripe about. Like not having achievements and all that sort of thing. I think that when it comes down to it, it's going back to what games used to be, which is pick up and play and have a hell of a time and not worry about all that other stuff, the stuff that's, extraneous and frankly, again, barriers. And again, I say this as someone who loves achievements and I love playing online and I love all these things, but sometimes I just want to play a goddamn game.
Yes. And it is very interesting about that kind of deviation from achievements, because I remember it was like 5, 6 years ago there were articles saying every game must have achievements. It's the newest thing. We need to motivate people to play these games. And then of course we turn around, we see Nintendo these days with these games that are just like here, go nuts and enjoy it for as long as you really want to.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I always go back to as a developer and as a gamer is that I don't like absolutes. I don't like when people say like, "Oh, games, it's not a game if it's if it's a walking simulator, or it's not a game unless if it has loot boxes, and oh, it's not games aren't art and all that." Like it's just like games are a million different things. Let's let them be that. Let's see where we can go with them. Let's push in different directions. Let's experiment. Let's get wacky. Let's get freaky. Let's get kinky, and let's not limit what it is, what they can be. And that's why, like, hey, I love that achievements exist. I'm not as wild about the fact that they're requirements in some regards, but they're there. They're a tool. You can use them, or you can or not. They can use them in ways that maybe downplay them. But the bottom line is, if you don't like it, you can go to Switch or you can go to Steam and not do them, or whatever it is. There's so many choices right now. When I see discussions about like games are or development is or all this sort of like absolutes, it drives me crazy.
Yeah, I know. A few weeks ago, like right around I think it was just either before or during the whole Black Friday week. I know you were talking about some of the things we saw with the game prices and
Yeah.
just the insanity with those game sales, which I thought was very interesting. And again, like I'm in the older generation as well. I remember games were $70, $80, and
Oh,
that
yeah.
was it.
Yeah.
So it was definitely weird to see all these AAA games priced like at $20, $25 right
Oh,
there.
I'm gravely concerned about what that means, and in fact, I'm in the process of writing something up. Doing, I don't have a ton of time, but I've been doing a little bit of research into sort of the prices of the past, and like I said that this is unprecedented. You've never seen games sales like this at Black Friday or ever. I've been following this very closely my entire life, and I will show, I will prove, I will show that like I'm going back through old Best Buy Black Friday ads, and you want to talk about how much this has changed. It used to be forever up until last year. It was like the games that would go on sale would be like Hannah Montana's like horse petting simulator, and that would be like $15, and that would be the highlight. There'd be like maybe 10 or 20 games,
Hmm.
and that would be the highlight. And like generally speaking, games used to never. I'm talking mostly on console here. The Steam thing has been out of control for a little while. But with regards to consoles, games would never go on sale the first 6 months. It would always be that the games that you saw released at the end of March, at the end of the first quarter, right? The Far Cries and this sort of thing, the really big Ubisoft titles. You would start to see those drop down to $40 and maybe $30 around August or September or whatever, and that was a big deal. Similarly, every year I would wait for the Toys R Us buy two get one free deal, right? Which
Oh
essentially is
yes.
20% off, but you have to buy 3 games. And that was a huge deal. That was like, oh my god, I'm getting 3 games for 20%. This is amazing. Um, Console games, just given the nature of the COGS, the cost of goods and services, and all of that, um, they just wouldn't drop in price. And this year it was an absolute bloodbath. Every single game was half off, and like you can say, listen, obviously I don't want to come off as anti-consumer because it's great that more people can play more games, but you have to realize that this means this is going to have knock-on effects, and we will see this next year. We will see, March, early next year when we start to see like, oh, the numbers of this game didn't sell that well, it wasn't that profitable.
Hmm.
Pink slips, studio closures, less AAA. Like we're already at a point now where the number of AAA games is greatly diminished. The if you compare, and again, if all you have to do is go and look at, and I have a data of this as well, but if you go and look at Wikipedia, the year on year number of titles released in AAA has I don't know exactly the numbers, but is greatly diminished. And of course, there are way more games being released now. You look at Steam, you look at the indies and all this sort of thing, and that's great. But the problem is when AAA stops selling and they drop their price to $30, the indie games that are $30 and $20, what happens there? What happens? They're
They.
going to have to drop to 15 and 10, and all of a sudden everything changes.
Hmm.
And so I'm seriously worried about the knock-on effects here. Not wow, this got really dark. I'm sorry.
Hmm.
I just think that there are a lot of issues that we're facing right now, and I'm concerned about them. And I do hope to sort of get people talking, because I think that we've conditioned the industry to, at this point, to just wait a month or two for games to go at half price, and that's a problem. And that there's a million reasons why that's happening. It's because of perhaps oversaturation. It's because of streaming. It's because of the conditioning of sales. It's because of piracy. It's because on and on and on. There's so many different disruptions going on right now. All at once. There's new things that have come out that are like that have made change and impacted sales, changed the way that games are made and played. And I think we need to come together and say like, okay, what's going on here, and how we're going to adjust to this.
Yeah.
But I think in general, the industry is really terrible at data.
Hmm. And also very bad at trying to come together and establish, set standards for everything.
Absolutely. And again, I love just to be clear, I love streaming and I love Let's Plays. I go, for me as a developer, as a gamer, they're entertaining, but as a developer, it's really useful. It's a useful
Oh
tool.
yeah.
I go in all the time and I watch. When we did our remaster that we released on Halloween, there are major updates on that that remaster,
Hmm.
and we spent months studying the way people were playing. We would just hop into streams, and that's like a free focus test.
Oh
You
yeah.
watch people playing, you listen to the way people are talking about it, and then you make adjustments to the game. So it's great. But at the same time, I go into developer forums all the time, and I ask like, hey, how have you found streaming to impact sales of games on your particular game and the games in the industry? And there's a lot of like, well, I think Five Nights at Freddy's did really well, because it was like, okay, well, that's about as anecdotal as it gets.
Yeah.
You tell me like, and I would talk to PR, marketing folks. I'd talk to, all across the industry, and everyone's just kind of like, I don't know. I guess it's popular. Maybe it's a good thing. I don't know. Which is sad, because I think that we make the industry better when we understand what's going on. Right? Data is a tool, but when you are just kind of using anecdotal evidence, just grasping at it, that's a danger. And
Hmm.
I'm always about trying to get as much data as possible.
Yeah, I mean, we look at this whole catastrophe, what's going on with EA with Battlefront 2 and
Right.
the loot boxes, and them trying to push things forward and getting pushed back. And
Yep.
I know a lot of people probably say, well, how could they have seen that coming? But then it's like varies like how could you not see what was going to happen when you're locking content behind loot boxes? And as you said, Bill, like there's a lot of data out there. Especially, I think for the post I made up, I was looking at what the ESA did in terms of their annual reports on the game industry and how much money we're pulling in or we're generating.
Yep.
But it's very, I think that's another really good point. It's very hard, I found, to find accurate data about a lot of these
Yeah. Yeah.
topics.
Well, like you talk about, yeah, we're celebrating 21 billion in industry revenue, but it's like, yeah, the market has expanded because we've introduced two new markets, and it's also like, well, you break it down, you talk about mobile. Like, I'm interested in, like, let's sit down and really analyze this as an industry and not just do a data dump.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, well, people will throw around those numbers, but it's like, okay, well, break it down across the number of titles, break it down
Oh yeah.
across the platforms, break it down. Like what I mentioned, there's two oversaturation. We have what? How many VR platforms do we have right now? The
Uh,
fact that,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. Who even knows at this point? The fact that we have, there are other elements, like, we just introduced the Xbox One X, which is hugely exciting, but that's unprecedented. We don't usually see the cost of consoles going up. Obviously there are cheaper versions as well, but the fact that we're introducing the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X early, late, what is it, 4 years in, and
Yeah,
we're getting
about
able to
that.
spend more money on the hardware, whereas usually that's going down. So do the math there. They're all of a sudden they have, if you're talking about, instead of saving $100 or $200, they're spending an extra $100 or $200. That means one or two extra less games or more. So that's going to impact the overall profitability of developers and publishers,
Yeah.
right? And listen, obviously, Microsoft, Sony, the first party, they have every right to try and make as much money as they can and try
Mm-hmm.
and capitalize on how the enormous expense of creating the hardware. The problem is that we have just, like, there's so much more money being spent now on these other things, on things like VR and peripherals and uh, upgrades to consoles that they used to go into to buying games, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a problem. Like, when you add it all up, you add up all these things, all of these, like, disruptions. I think it's leading us toward. And to be clear, I don't think the industry's ever going to disappear or crash, or, like, we're not going to stop playing games. But I do think that there's going to be a lot of pain in the future if we're not careful.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking as well. That it's going to come down to the guys who are going to win, the ones who are going to, have a successful game. They're still going to be successful. Like I
Yeah,
said, like Blizzard is not going to be their next game is not going to do well. Let's put it that way. Or
yeah,
if whatever Nintendo announces next, like if there's a Mario Odyssey 2, I
yep.
don't think we're going to have to worry about that one not making money. But for everybody else, there are developers who've been like trying to break even or just get a little bit ahead. It's going to
Yep,
become a lot harder for them to stay financially viable
yep,
when everything is being pushed together like that.
yep.
And a question that was brought up a few minutes ago regarding the issue of sales. Oscar wanted to know how was your experience for you and Perception with this being like your first big sale period, with Black Friday and Perception.
Sure. So, if I'm being honest here, we do have a partner that controls a little bit of that, so I don't fully know the impact there. I think it definitely has made things a lot more difficult to kind of predict and understand, given that, you know, if I'm being honest here, I talk to most other devs, and there's a lot of head scratching. There's a lot of, what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you? And let me give you one concrete example of where things have changed. It used to be that when you release a game, the first 3 or 4 weeks was, I don't know the number, but it was the overwhelming majority of your sales. That was always like 50% of your sales was in the first month, right?
Yeah, like 30 to
I think
45 days, I've heard. Like, it's like the
sure,
general
yeah,
idea
yeah,
here.
yeah, 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 absolutely. And so what's happened more recently is that you start to have a much longer tail. It just goes. It's a lot more flat but it goes on for a really, really long time. And again, anecdotally, and I've seen some data, but anecdotally, every developer I talk to sort of confirms this. And so I think that's a bit of a product of the way that, because of the way Steam has changed things for good or for bad. I don't know. And now that you're seeing it on the consoles, I think that we do have some catching up to do in terms of understanding the data and how to act on that. But for me, we haven't set the only price that we're setting ourselves is on the Switch, which we've done well with. Technically, it's on sale right now for $14.99. That was our launch price, and it still is through the end of the year. But yeah, I'm going to definitely look at our data as closely as I can and see, find what works best. But I think this, there's just so many like, whoa, what's going on, that I don't know exactly how we'll act on it. I'm sorry, it's not a very good answer, but there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of apprehension right now, I feel, in the industry, where people are trying to find their ground, if you will, trying to find their footing.
Yeah. And going back to what you were saying a few minutes ago, Bill, regarding the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, I did just look it up. They both came out in 2013, so that's a 4-year period, and we're now getting not a new console, but essentially an update. And I found that to be very weird as well, because obviously, as you're aware, I'm sure for the folks watching, traditionally when a new console comes out, that's a new console generation. All the old games disappear, we get to the new ones.
Yep.
So we're extending this development cycle, which on one hand I think it's good by the fact that it means these games are remain relevant for a bit longer. But
True.
in the same breath, though, again, it's odd because, as we said, this is the kind of stuff we expect for PC. We expect to buy new PC parts every few years. I know I am more than at that point, or I think I hit that point 2 years ago, that it's probably time to update. But for the console side, it is just a weird feeling to say that, which PS4 do I buy? Do I buy the normal one? Do I buy the Pro? And I know there's even like smaller versions, I think, of that, like with like a smaller disk drive or a smaller hard drive as well.
No, absolutely, and I think that I think you're right about the keeping games relevant for longer because of a longer life cycle. Although I would say that with the PS3 and Xbox 360, the PS3 in particular, that was like what was it? Was an 8 or 9 year life cycle. And that was the price of the system kept going down, 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 right? And so you were introducing more and more people, and ultimately it sold what? It sold like 90, 100 million units or something like that. I don't know off the top of my head, but it sold a lot of units, and the price kept going down, which meant that the more people you were introducing to the system, the more money they would have to spend on games, right? That has radically changed now. And again, there are other options. You can buy your system used. You can buy the slim versions. You can buy the Pro versus the regular versus the Pro, all that sort of thing. But the bottom line is that the price there, that is a big factor. Like, games are expensive, and so I don't envy the consumer having to not only make these decisions like you were talking about like what's the difference between these two things, but then also the fact that they're going to have less money to spend on games, and that the hardware just hasn't really dropped the way it has in previous generations. Yeah, man, it's an interesting time. I don't see a lot of people, a lot of analysts, a lot of journalists really like taking a step back and being like, what's going on here? This is a weird generation. Like, it's, but by any stretch, in any means or comparisons, there's a lot of strange things that we've never encountered before. And again, with the sheer number of titles, with the sort of weird place that AAA is, with the cost of hardware, with the cost of software, on and on and on. It's a weird time, man.
Yeah, and like I was just telling people about this for like Black Friday. Like, I spent about, I guess I want to say about $88, and I got about 8 video games for that amount of money. And like, on one hand, like, it's always that weird thing about, especially in my position, because I like to consider myself like that middle ground between the consumer side and developer side. So when I think about it from the consumer side, I'm like, oh my goodness, I got 8 games for less than $100. Go me. But then I think about, how the hell are those developers making money when I'm buying their games at like $10 to $15, and even in some cases less than that?
Yeah, which is awesome. It's awesome for you, and it's awesome for gamers. I think that, and I'm sure that there are ways that developers can make this work. What concerns me, I was talking before about the whole like, oh, the absolutes, right?
Hmm.
And it's interesting to me because I'm in no way defending Battlefront, but the sort of I do feel like a lot the reaction there was kind of not in line with the offense, and it threw me off a little bit because I had seen this for years and years through other developers. I mean, like EA themselves. I love. Did you play Garden Warfare, Plants
Uh,
vs Zombies, the first one?
no, but I did actually buy number two while it was on
Okay.
sale during the Black Friday.
Oh, funny. So two, they go a little bit further with it, but I mean, I love the first one. I think is one of the better multiplayer shooters of this and the past generation. It's really spectacular stuff. They have really good class based system. It's probably one of the best Team Fortress clones I think that's out there. Really interesting stuff, really interesting classes, some nice balance, and a fantastic progression system. There's some really great rewards and growth systems and all of that. But they had loot boxes. They had them in the form of these decks of cards that you could earn through points in the game, but you could also pay if you want to just move things along faster. They struck an interesting balance though, in that it felt like you could. It didn't feel like grinding to me. And they didn't get dinged for it because I think they found the right balance. Where I did actually buy, I don't even know how many decks I bought, but I did buy quite a few just because it felt like I was making good progress, but I was really incentivized to make faster progress.
Hmm.
But I also felt that because I got to maybe level, I don't know, 90 in the game, it felt like I was making good, steady progress, and I was having a great time doing it. But it had its hooks in me enough that I was really enjoying it. I was like, I'd like to level up faster, and so a couple occasions I shelled out for the loot boxes essentially. Nobody, as far as I know, nobody said a thing. I didn't see any negativity about it at all. I think they presented it the right way. And similarly, like Blizzard has been toying with this. I know it's mostly cosmetic with obviously certainly with Overwatch, it's entirely cosmetic. But they've been playing around with monetization in a whole mess of different ways. You look at the auction house with Diablo,
Hmm.
which honestly I felt like Blizzard got a free pass. I felt like that completely ruined the
Oh
game,
yes.
and I felt like everyone would just nobody, the press and reviewers just didn't really give them the hard time that I think they deserve. They took one of the most beloved games and one of the most brilliant designs in the history of gaming, and for whatever reasons, whatever happened internally, they completely changed that for what seemed like entirely monetization. They were anyway. That didn't get the kind of scrutiny that I felt it did. In retrospect, once they fixed it, there was a lot of, hey, this is way better. And why didn't you do this in the first place when they patched it 2 years later? Um, but man, oh man, what like I look at that as one of the biggest fiascos in gaming.
Yeah.
Um, but here we are, talking about Battlefront, where uh, did a lot of the same things that other games have done. And I don't know why we choose to pick on this one. I mean, do you know what do you think? What particulars? And feel free. I'd like to hear what anyone listening has to say. And pardon my ignorance here, but what is it particular about this that's different in other games that have done this?
Hmm.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting because what a lot of people have been saying about Battlefront 2 has to do with the amount of grinding. Basically, I think the divide between the paying and the non-paying players. And I think that's where I think this discussion gets very interesting. I think like when it was originally reported, and someone data mined the amount of cost it would take like 40 hours of playing to unlock like each one of the game's premium heroes if you didn't spend money.
Hmm.
And it's I think that's where people are finding that issue. Like we've talked about this before with again with Team Fortress 2 and how they really try to balance time versus money in
Hmm.
terms of that value so that both sides are
Sure.
getting a fair deal.
Yep.
Obviously if you spend money, you're going to move faster. I mean, I think we've all come to expect that. But
Sure.
I think the problem is like for a lot of people, they feel like the non-paying players are kind of being given the short end of the stick. Like the experience is not being balanced for them. But I think the other aspect of this is the fact that it came with a $60 price tag on top of it. And that's something that I know a lot of the people in my chat were talking about, with the fact that if this was a free to play game, if they released Battlefront 2 to be free and
Yeah,
had this at all, it probably would have looked at things a lot more differently than saying,
sure,
here's $60, now add 30, 40 more on top of that. Like,
sure.
I was just been playing. Have you ever played the game Warframe, Bill?
I hear about it all the time, but no, I haven't played it yet.
Uh, yeah, my friend, like Oscar and Che, he's been bugging me for months to finally play, so I installed it last week.
Yeah,
So this is an entire free to play game, and basically, like anything and everything in that game has a microtransaction cost to it. If I want to buy a different color to make my guy look, or if I want my ship to have like an extra fancy space trail, there's a premium cost of that. And a lot of the game, there's an entire. Not only is the in-game shop meant for the paying customers, it's also how non-paying customers can upgrade and buy new gear that they'll be able to use.
okay.
And the game itself, like I was talking about this, I mean, you can pretty much buy your way into power in that game. If you have
Yep,
enough money, you could buy, pick whatever you want. But
sure.
for a lot of people, it doesn't feel like it's exploitive. Like, and that I think is a very interesting topic about when does a game become a grind. And I'm not sure if you saw in the videos, but I've made several videos about that one in the past. When does a game start to feel like it's a grind?
Okay.
And that I
If
think.
I think everything you're saying here makes perfect sense, and I'm definitely sensitive to it. My feeling is that I think part of the reaction is because it was based on an established franchise, both in Star Wars but also Battlefront,
Mhm.
where it didn't exist previously, and then you try and introduce it. And so that I understand that that's a little bit. It feels a little bit like more of a betrayal. But again, in some of EA's own games and lots of other games, they have similar approaches. And you're talking about Warframe. If they had released a Warframe 1 and it was just a straight up shooter or whatever, and then all of a sudden they introduced Warframe 2 or whatever,
Mhm.
and it introduced that. I feel like, and I've noticed this in other instances where, if you change something up in this way for a sequel, people, rightfully so, tend to react.
Yeah.
It's an interesting case. It really is. And, I'm all for, obviously, I'm a developer, but I'm all for people trying to find different ways to monetize things, and to try and find something that works. Yeah, like I said, with
Mhm.
the garden warfare experience that I had, I felt like that was strictly a positive, where it didn't feel like I was cheating. It didn't feel like the people who were doing it before me were getting an unfair advantage, and they found, I think, a really good balance. And so I think when I see these kind of things, I'm always interested to see how they play out, obviously, but I am always about trying to find where the boundaries are and push things in different directions so we can. I think it creates a healthier industry, and I like by all means, get angry, protest or whatever, but it's important to consider that we need to, like, part of this is about feeling things out, and it's not always coming from a place of like, I'm going to screw over the gamer.
Mhm.
I think a lot of times it does come from a place of, holy shit, these costs are going way up. These other games are doing this thing. Let's try this out and see how it goes. I don't view it as mustache twirly. The same way I don't view people being upset as a problem. I think that people are entitled to voice their concerns and try and make games better. I'm mostly interested in people talking things through.
Mhm. And I think, as you said, that the fact that's happening with established brands, I think, also has a different impact than if this was just an original game.
Yes.
Now, one thing that was very interesting, I don't know if you heard the news about the game Paladins. I think it happened a week
Yeah.
or 2 weeks ago.
What happened?
But they decided to change their monetization model. That what they're doing is they're doing the whole kind of like loot box integration of their game, where
Okay.
everybody starts with like. I haven't played the game, but I heard that it goes with you have different cards, they have skills, and you attach them to your character. So
Okay.
everyone starts with like level 1 cards, but the only way to level them up is to get like the duplicates in the loot boxes. and this was a completely different monetization system than what was originally in the game. I don't know how
Okay.
long it's been out for, and I think again that raises that very interesting topic. Ooh. It's like very similar to, as you said, with like game prices. That
Yeah.
you can lower a game price as many times as you want, but if you start raising things up or mixing around with that,
Hmm.
it can ruin your previous perception of that.
Yep.
Like
Yep.
Payday 2 being another example. When the original Payday was released, they had a few bits of DLC here and there, but
Yep.
it was mostly self-contained. With
Yep.
Payday 2, they went 100% games as a service.
Yep.
And while it did succeed for them, they've always received like some minor pushback from fans saying, "But I don't want to spend $50, $60 on, you know, mission packs and mask packs and weapons packs." And then what's very interesting, they kind of had their own like EA Battlefront 2 moment when they introduced loot boxes in the form of the microtransaction safes, where you had to spend like $2.99 to open up a safe, and you didn't know what you got,
Yeah.
and that caused one hell of a controversy to the point that they just said, you know what, we'll keep the safes, but now we're just going to give it to you for free.
Yeah.
But again, like as you said, it's very interesting where those lines are met because a lot of this stuff is brand new.
Yeah.
So, like, I guess here's a question for you. That actually gives me a very interesting one. And for you folks watching this as well, I'm curious what you think. What do you think is that fair use of loot boxes? Because as
Yeah.
we've seen, like, I'm definitely not a fan of them, although I have played games that have used them in some sense of the word, be it something like Hearthstone or Gwent, or
Yeah.
even Payday 2 with how Gears dropped. But
Yeah.
I guess for you, like, what do you think, or is there a point where it is acceptable to have this kind of system in your game?
Right. That's a good question. Again, for me, it was the Garden Warfare, but I'm curious to hear what other people think.
Yeah, we'll see how questions pop up in chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like Mike is saying right now that he feels like there is no fair use for in-app purchases loot boxes, and again, it's very interesting. Like I think I would agree with that, but also saying like loot boxes with an in-game currency. Now that's again, it's this one of the things we've talked about many times over that real money changes things. There's a
Sure.
big difference between grinding rifts in Diablo 3 for epic level gear when it's entirely on your time versus saying replacing that with a gotcha system where I have to give Blizzard, let's say, 50 cents every time I want to run a riff, or 50
Right.
cents every time I want to identify an item.
Right. Sure. I mean, again, Blizzard, they had where you can go and buy weapons,
Hmm.
which you think about the amount of time you spend grinding trying to find that epic loot, versus going right to the shop and spending the 20 whatever someone has priced that particular loot at. I like that the market decided what the prices of the things are. I think that's a good approach rather than arbitrarily having a developer saying, "Oh, this is the price." I think that was interesting. And it's a model that Blizzard had toyed with certainly for a while. With obviously they had the auction house in WoW, which was all in game currency, and then obviously things changed. But yeah, I mean, so again, I think the important thing is that it's about trying these things out, and it's about trying to find the do's and don'ts, I guess, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
it's always shocking to me to see how sometimes you're surprised as a developer to see that there are opinions that you didn't even realize existed, that there were strong enthusiasts and all this passion that you didn't realize existed. Like, to give you an example, after we shipped Bioshock, we got a lot of flack about the resolution that the game ran at. Sorry, the FOV that the game was at. And so what happened here, to give a little bit of context, was that we had developed quite a bit of the game, and we felt like the big daddies didn't feel big enough. We felt like the world felt pretty good, but it felt like you were a little tall compared to the big daddies. And so we played around with a few things, but in order to change the scale, it would require some animation changes, the model change, or like a whole mess of changes are going to be pretty costly and generate some bugs, and we wouldn't know how it would affect the game ultimately, long term. Meanwhile, we had this other change we could do where we changed the FOV, the field of view, and that we were able to do that with a console command and be able to see like, oh wow, this feels very different, and that's exactly the kind of feel with some basic tuning that we want for the Big Daddy. And so in that change, we were able to, basically the resolution that we had the game set at was kind of overkill. And so we wound up ultimately for some savings changing the resolution of the game. And this was, it wasn't early in development, but it was early enough in development that we got to the end and we didn't realize it was going to be an issue. We shipped the game, and then some people somehow found out that the game wasn't in full, 1080 or whatever it was on consoles, and it was like HDenthusiast.com was like, the game's not full HD. What's going on? And like, there's all this outrage, and I just remember Ken being like, whoa, what? This is a thing? I didn't even know that people were like really gonna pixel count, or that was in no way meant to be. To belittle those interests or those concerns. It's just kind of one of those things you don't realize that, like, wow, people are really passionate about this, and we screwed up, and then we patched it. And so I think EA didn't handle the Battlefront thing very well. There's certainly some PR flops. I saw, with the Reddit, the AMA, and all that sort of thing. And I don't envy those developers because there's company line and there's higher ups who've made decisions, and you kind of have to toe the line, and so it's tricky. But I think that ultimately it's about a conversation, and hopefully, if things are expressed in a way that makes sense, and there's something you can do about it, you fix it. And so EA had a pretty epic backpedal here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so. They were able to, I think, fix it. I don't know. Like, I've heard stuff about the sales maybe not being as good. I don't know, but you see stories about it. Hopefully, it does well because I've heard good stuff about the actual game. I don't know. Like, are people playing it right now?
I think they're still playing, but I think they suffered. I think their stocks lost like $6 billion, or they said they lost. They took a really big hit because of it. And I think going back to what you said a few minutes ago regarding like that perception that it's mustache twirling, like the evil developer sitting behind
Sure.
messing with the game. I think I was gonna just say, why is Bill's camera not in HD? My camera, I don't think it's an old camera. I don't know if it's HD or not either. But I think that's one of the more interesting points about this perception of, I guess, time versus money. Like, how do you perceive if these two factors are fair? Because like Battlefront 2, for instance, like they were saying like it would take 40 hours of play per character. That was the original, before any of this broke. And like on one hand, I can imagine designers saying, "Hey, we're going to keep people playing for 40 plus hours to enjoy this game." But on the other hand, you think, "Oh my goodness, someone's going to have to play this game for." I'm not sure how many like heroes there are, but it must be at least over 100 hours of playing the exact same game to reach the same point that someone could just spend. I don't know. I honestly don't know what the money to time ratio was. And
I'm curious to see what the data is. Yeah.
and I think that's kind of where things get very interesting about at what point do you overstep that boundary? Because again, like people are not complaining about Hearthstone. They didn't complain about Garden Warfare. I don't hear anyone complain about Warframe. And again, that game is a full-on microtransaction shop. But as Oscar was saying in chat, it's perceived, and I think from what I play, it does feel like it's fair to the player who doesn't want to spend money. But at the same time, if I want to spend money and move a little bit faster, I'm able to do so.
Sure.
But I think that's the big question. How do you satisfy both groups? And again, it goes back to when does that game no longer feel like I'm making progress? Because as you said with Garden Warfare, you always felt like you were moving forward. Like it never felt like the game just dropped the wall down in front of you and said, "Please insert $5 to continue."
Right. Yeah, and I think that so I don't know where that lies. I think it's very subjective, and I think that it's going to differ from player to player. And that's why it's important to just keep open dialogue. I think it's important to things don't get fixed based on when feedback isn't constructive. When it gets into, and I'm not saying anyone. Well, I did see it, but when you talk about mustache twirling, one of the things right now with developers right now, you see a lot of developers kind of rolling their eyes a little bit. Like there's a bit of a meme right now about lazy dev, right? And it's like I can't imagine like listen, everyone. I'm sure most people work bust their ass for their money to buy a game. I've been there. I haven't always been a developer. I remember being in college and literally having to decide Castlevania 64. I could buy this and not eat a meal for the next couple of weeks. Like I'm going to not spend money at Zero Marlboro, where our sort of secondary food hall at Emerson College. I can not spend money on food for a few weeks for one of my meals, and maybe get to go and get some Kraft mac and cheese because the game was 60. I might have been $70 because it was Nintendo 64. 70 bucks in 1999 or whatever. It's a lot of money. And like I said, I get it. Games are expensive, right? It's an expensive hobby. And again, they wouldn't go on sale. But yeah, I think it's about finding that balance. I think this comes out like it's the kind of thing that I don't know what the process was there, and it's impossible as a developer to know what EA and the developers went through to come to the decisions that they did. They did. I'm assuming that they did a lot of testing. It seems to me like it's the kind of thing that they could have ferreted out relatively earlier on and perhaps nipped it more in the bud. I don't remember when they announced it. It seems like this whole controversy came up within the span of 3 or 6 months before they shipped, and so systems come online sometimes a little bit late, and I get that. But I think that the sort of frustrating thing to me is that if it is in fact 40 hours I don't know, I'm not confirming this, but if it is 40 hours to unlock a new character and there are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more or whatever, that's too much. And that's just sort of a basic math question where it's like I understand a little bit of the outrage, but again, I don't want to comment because I don't know for sure. I think it's just really about again, it's about data. It's about EA getting the data and trying to act on that early on. It's about the press and gamers getting the data of like how long is it actually to unlock these things, and what how how much does it cost to do, as an alternative? Because if it's strictly for the longest time there were a lot of people who were, and to this day there are people who are like, bah, never DLC, bah, like it's always on disc and it's always bullshit. And it's like, that's not true. There are a lot of developers, myself included, who have worked on games who have spent an epic shit ton of money and time to add additional content after the fact, and are trying to bring additional value, and also trying to make development sustainable in the sense that you ramp up your development, and you hire more and more people, and you're creating your best content at the most efficient pace very, very late in production, and then you kind of have a little bit of a break after you ship, and it's like, okay, what's next? Well, you could take that team of 100, 200, 300 people and like everyone kind of twiddle their thumbs while people are concepting things, right? Or you can take that energy, take that talent, take that skill and expertise, and turn it into something like we did with Burial at Sea episode 1 and 2 for BioShock, which I thought, again, I'm biased here, but we got some good reviews, and I think it was pretty exceptional. I think it changed. I think the value proposition was crazy good there. If you break down the money versus the amount of content and all that sort of stuff, and so if you're a purist where it's like never DLC, that's just not healthy. That's not helpful, and that's why when I see discussions about loot boxes, oh, they're gambling and that's wrong, and that's coming from I feel like a puritanical perspective. And when frankly, I'll say flat out that when people are saying like the government needs to prevent this, I just want to say like, we just don't even have. There's no middle ground here. We're on completely different planets. That is the slipperiest of slippery slopes. You do not want the government in on this. Let's not forget how hard we had to fight Jack Thompson in the 90s and the 2000s, trying to keep him from saying like games are bad for you. Like we should be able to, like, I'm always going to say, do not hamper artists if they're exploiting people on the development side, or if they're exploiting gamers and like, well, you have to play 1,000 hours in order to unlock this thing. Either the market's probably going to straighten that out, right? But when you start to get into like, oh, we need to define this as gambling, I was like, holy shit. Do you sure you really want to do that? Because if you're going to define that as gambling, what does that mean for World of Warcraft? What does that mean for Call of Duty? What does that mean
Mm-hmm.
for all the games that you care about? Do you really want these people, in your living room sitting next to you and be like, huh, you've played a long time here, huh? And how much money did you spend on this game? And how much time are you playing here grinding? This isn't balanced properly. Like, it's like, that's scary.
Yeah.
Again, discussion. I'm all about like understanding that let's not get into absolutes. Let's talk things through.
Yeah. And I think what you just said there about that perception of value is such a big part about this because,
100%.
as we said, like there are no standards for how much a video game should cost. I mean, look at the last decade. We've seen games from $60, $70 down to free. And
Yep.
it's just very hard to really put a price tag on value.
Sure.
Not just in the independent space, but among AAA developers. As you
Yep.
said, like you buy a game like Battlefront 2 for $60. If you're just playing the campaign, that could be, 3, 4 hours. If you're playing multiplayer, that could be who knows how many months if you really
Yep.
get hooked on it.
Yep.
Like Left 4 Dead 2, I have easily over 1,000 hours playing that
Nice.
game,
Nice.
and like I barely spend money on that. Or the buying of Isaac, I have over 100 hours, and I bought it for $10.
Nice.
And I was just talking about this like with the comic book industry. Like I was trying to get into comic books. I bought like a hard cover, like a collection of a story for like $5, and I got like
Yep.
15 minutes out of that. I'm like, wait, I could just take that $5. I could buy a video game and get like 4 to 5 hours of entertainment. So it's very hard to really see that. And as you said earlier, like when you're putting AAA right next to independent developers at that same price, it becomes even more muddled. Like I mentioned this during the sale. I bought Horizon Zero Dawn for $20. I bought the expansion to Grim Dawn for $15. And that's an expansion to an independent game that's $5 less than a AAA big budget
Oh,
game
man.
that was released in February.
Yeah, we're screwed. Games are screwed. No, but Horizon came out in like March, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's a bit of an extenuating circumstance there, but it's more like, again, when you saw pretty much every single, like
Mm-hmm.
Bethesda in particular, that really broke my heart. I love the games that they make and all that sort of thing. But I mean, they have had like, I would argue it's one of the best years any publisher has ever had. You had Wolfenstein 2,
Mm-hmm.
you had Prey, you had Dishonored 2, and the sort of whatever you want to call it, expansion or whatever, and then you had Skyrim on the Switch. That is 5 phenomenal games, all well reviewed, all, and like with the exception of Skyrim, which obviously it's a Switch version or whatever. All those other titles, those deserve to sell through the roof. Like, I know that like there's some controversy, like some people are like Prey, oh, it has problems or whatever. I think it's fantastic. But the bottom line is those are like high risk taking games, right? Those are games that cost a lot to make. There's a lot of like or challenge in developing them, and they're relatively niche, right? You talk about the fact that they're open sandbox games, they're first person, there are all these different elements that are weeding people out, and they only a very small portion of the market is going to be into that. It's not GTA, right? And to see those games pretty much right away drop to half price. You don't drop your price unless you have to.
Mm-hmm.
Like Nintendo, for example, in Take-Two, pretty much all of their games they hold their value. I mean, GTA, like that's a terrible example because that's like the best of the best, right?
Mm-hmm.
GTA is still selling, pretty much at full price. Occasionally you see it go down $20 or whatever, but it's still relatively full price, even though the game came out, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, I feel like it's been out for a while.
Yeah, and Nintendo games, by extension, they just don't drop in price. Like occasionally, after 3 or 4 years, they'll do a Nintendo Classics or best of whatever the hell they want to call it, million sellers or whatever, and those will drop $20 or whatever, and you'll be able to get them for 40 or $30. And that's because they've fought to maintain value the same way Disney will try and fight to keep their value. But because we've had years and years of Steam basically like pounding people's heads, oh, you'll make more money if you sell it cheaper. Like go on crazy sale, sell it for 75% off. You'll wind up making more money, and ultimately to Valve, they don't care how much money you're making. They just want to generate more excitement and get more people spending more money. It doesn't matter if you're not going to play the game. If you spent, to them, buying 5 games at $20 total, there's no difference between that and not playing any of those games than there is at buying 1 game for $20 and playing it or not playing it, right? You see what I'm saying? Like, you want to get people excited to come in, and they're not paying anything. I mean, obviously they pay for the downloads and all that sort of thing, but for them, it's they're heavily incentivized to push as many people into the store as possible, and even if that's destructive to developers. And I know that their intent is not to hurt developers. That's long term. That's terrible. But although I do think there are more developers now, so they certainly could afford that. Anyway, wow, geez, tangents.
Man. Yeah, I know we do have to move on to horror. So I have one last question regarding like state of sales and whatnot. And again, we could probably spend another hour on this topic as well. But I want to get your thoughts on this, Bill. Do you
Sure.
think there will be a time where we will see a AAA free-to-play game? As
Of course.
in,
Absolutely.
you think, all right.
100%. I mean, haven't we already? Let me think about this for a second. Hold on. I'm not sure if we already have, but I think absolutely. I think that generally speaking, AAA, especially nowadays, is going to be as adverse to taking risk as possible. And when you talk about radical new monetization strategies, that's a big risk,
Yeah.
right? But the development of games is like, the costs have gone way up in the AAA space for sure. But it just seems like a no-brainer. Like, of course, Blizzard or someone is going to do that. It's just, it's like I said, it's a no-brainer, and especially with there's so much again all that disruption that I keep talking about. I think that you do have to try some stuff, and I think that the next couple of years in particular, you'll see more and more, ambitious attempts to shake things up because oh man, there's just too much apprehension right now. Too much like what the hell's going on.
All right, and I would love to talk to you more about this, Bill, but we are over an hour in. We haven't even gotten to our main topic,
Oh wow.
so we gotta get going. We'll be here till like midnight or
I
some,
need to
probably even
shut
later
up,
than
yeah.
that. But let's talk about horror, because this is a genre that has certainly come a long way over the last 2 decades. Actually, yeah, a little over 2 decades if we want to count Alone in the Dark. But the horror genre itself has certainly gone through many transitional periods, from survival horror to action horror to even what we're seeing among the independent space with games like Five Nights at Freddy's, Perception, Outlast, and the like. So,
Yep.
I guess the first question to, begin this topic then is, what are some of your favorite examples of horror design in video games, Bill?
So, I'm very passionate about horror. Although it's interesting because I don't want to jump the gun here, but we in the past we have called perception horror, but as we've gotten a lot of feedback and as we've sort of figured out what it is that we have and what we've created, we've moved more towards calling it a thriller. I feel that coming in, I again, no matter how passionate I have been about horror, I was really surprised at how stringent the definition was for people. For me, my favorite horror games are always going to be Silent Hill 2, the original Fatal Frame, Resident Evil, obviously. And there's quite a few other ones, but those are the big three. I think in particular, Silent Hill 2, primarily because what they did with narrative and a lot of the symbolism, and it is just a rich game that is just rife with all kinds of interpretation, and I really enjoy talking about it. Like it's an interesting mix because it's one of those games that at its surface you'd be like, oh, it's I like to call it a meat circus.
Hmm.
because there's all these meaty, awful creatures that are like, oh, that's gross or that's scary and that sort of thing. You look at Pyramid Head, you look at the mannequins, the inverted mannequins with the two pairs of legs. They're creepy, they're unsettling, but when you actually look at them and you look at the context of the story, they have meaning. And I'm not going to spoil anything all these years later, but it's fascinating to me the way that they found an interesting balance where it had accessible horror, but also a lot of deep seated meaning and a lot of I think it's probably one of the more literary works out there. You talk about what the game represents in terms of James's journey, what it represents in terms of his, you talk about the enemies a lot of times representing his own sexual frustrations. There's a very clear intent there.
Hmm.
If you played Silent Hill 2?
Yeah. Oh yes, yes, I
Yeah.
have.
Yeah. So anyway, long story short, that was a big influence for us and certainly one of my favorites. But I'm all over the map. I play pretty much everything. And, Fatal Frame and Silent Hill 2 are probably my two favorites.
Hmm. And like going back to like Silent Hill, I said with the Pyramid Head guy, that was one like thinking about that was like one of like the first real examples of like an actual like horror protagonist, I think, in a video game. Because up until that point, we had the nondescript zombies.
Yep.
I'm trying to remember the time frame. If
So it was PlayStation 2. It was a year after launch. I think it was 2001.
2001. So did Resident Evil 3 was that out already by
I
that point?
believe so, because the first one was 96, 96. So I believe that
Yeah.
Resident Evil 3, I could look it up, but I believe it was 99.
Yeah,
I could be.
that's what Wikipedia is saying. Yeah, so like Nemesis and like Pyramid were like the first, I think, really two like examples of like the enemy becoming like I guess like a personality of the
Yep.
game. Like
Yep.
traditionally, that's what we saw with like 80s and
Yep.
yeah, I think like the 80s horror period with Hellraiser, Friday the
Yep.
13th, Nightmare on Elm Street,
Yep.
that the villain became like the title character in those movies.
Yep.
And like with Silent Hill, like as you said, it really added. I still remember like the first time we played that. I mean, I was young. Like I was, oh my goodness, how old was I when I actually played Silent Hill 2? I've lost all
Okay.
track of time there. But it was like, what the hell is that guy doing? And then I would like years later, I was like, oh yeah, it was all about sexual frustration. I'm like, really? And I thought, oh, now
Yep.
I see it. Like
Yep.
once you put that thought,
Yep.
like you can't unsee it.
Exactly. Yeah, amazing stuff. I just, we try to, I think it's in our nature. Amanda's my wife, and she's the writer and producer on Perception, and we try to imbue as much of that um, sort of symbolism and meaning and references. She's an English teacher, or she was a high school English teacher, so I think we talk about literary references and that sort of thing. That Perception is rife with them, and
Hmm.
it's really exciting to see people pick up on that. And the same way, it's super exciting to have talks about Pyramid Head and what how he represents James and
Hmm.
all of this. I don't want to sound pretentious about taking games to a whole new level, but I think to some level that's the goal is
Hmm.
to try new things. I talk about trying out different monetization strategies, and it's the same thing with narrative.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I know how to create a static uh, replication or a duplicate or whatever of like I could create just a standard, and I'm trying to belittle survival horror. There's a craft there, and there's a lot of challenge for sure, but the blueprint is there, and to create that is one thing, but to try and do something different, to try and do a thing where perception in a lot of ways, one of my goals was to try and create a challenge in a different way. I wanted to tickle people's brains in a different way, and frankly, I wanted to try a different skill set. The idea of spatial intelligence. Games rely on it quite a bit, but I don't view that there being that many games that really push it.
Hmm.
That really say like you walk into a room, for example, and be like, okay, I remember, okay, I see the stairs. I just revealed that with my echolocation. I tap my cane, and the stairs is right there. That means if I walk over here without taking the risk of tapping more and alerting the presence, if I walk in this direction, I'm going to hit the dining room, right? And sort of feel your way around. And then as you're walking closer, you can kind of get a little bit of a reference. Okay, there's the door. Okay, I'm good. and there's apprehension there, but there's also that different skill level. And when people pick up on that, that's hugely rewarding. It's because it's a huge risk we took. Frankly, if I wanted to do the traditional route, I could have created something that, and I am no way knocking Outlast because I like Outlast quite a bit. It was a big inspiration for me, and that sort of hide and seek mechanics that we have. But the blueprints are there. There's Amnesia, there's Soma, there's Outlast. There's all these games that show you here's how you do the hide and seek game, right? But I wanted to do a little bit of that, but also get people to challenge people in different ways. The same way we challenge the people narratively, and to get people thinking, like to put you in the shoes of somebody, an echolocator, and to tease the story in different ways, and try and layer in hints, not like Shyamalan, not like I'm not pretentious enough to say like, oh, we're like M. Night Shyamalan, but I did want to create something that when you play the game, you're getting all these hints, and then when you go back and you play it again, you're like, oh, wait a minute, this thing that I've been hearing or seeing, it means something different now. Wow, tangent, sorry. I ramble a lot.
But I'm glad you brought up Outlast and the Amnesia series, because that takes me to one of the questions I want to ask you, and probably a very interesting topic, and that is on the concept of power in horror games, because this is, I think, one of the more polarizing topics, and it's one of the big divides between what we see with horror in the last decade and what we saw previously.
Yeah.
Like, I know for my fans watching this, they're, I think, along with me, that I just could not get into games like Amnesia and Outlast. I felt that not having the option to fight, I thought it robbed, like, I always say it's about fight and flight, fight or flight,
Yep.
there we go.
Yep.
That
Sure.
when you don't have that, it makes the experience feel, it feels more like a ride or like a haunted
Sure.
house rather than being in those shoes. Like we mentioned
Sure.
earlier with like 80s horror, that a major part of watching that was you're seeing how is this 16-year-old girl going to fight Freddy Krueger, or how are these group of teens going to get away from Jason and whatnot. And they have to, like, you can do combat without it being Resident Evil, or even like what they do with Dead Space and how the series added more action elements to it. But it's very tricky, I think, to get that balance right, because as you said, like with a character like in Perception, she is not a fighter. There is zero combat in this game, and there wasn't meant to be combat. And it's always that balance of how do I make the player feel like they're in control without saying, "Oh, this guy's coming at you," but you can't do anything about it. You're just dead.
Sure. Yep. Well, it's really fascinating to me because, and I totally hear that. Two pieces here. Number one, it's really interesting to me because, with the Bioshock series, I was sort of fighting that from the opposite end, where, Bioshock is not really a horror game. There are horror elements, and there are sections that are, scary and have, are horror-ish.
Yeah.
The very beginning of the game, and, and Medical Pavilion, and parts of Fort Frolic and that sort of thing. But it's interesting because a lot of the challenge there is that you have all these crazy powers, and it's difficult to make you feel, and in some cases, it's impossible to make you feel really threatened. We could have introduced a T-Rex or something like that, some unstoppable creature that would have made, these weapons are useless or whatever. But that's obviously a lot of additional time and work, and you have to bite off the narrative of like making that believable, and it's this whole separate thing. But the idea that so many horror games, you have this challenge of feeling like you're not frightened because you can fight back, and because with skill you can overcome. It's interesting because Nemesis in Resident Evil 3, they made it unstoppable. Although I can't remember if you can kill it, but more or less effectively it was unstoppable, and you had all these weapons. So they found a good balance. They had the T-Rex that I talked about. But that was the whole game was about this, creating, like, you have all these zombies that you can kind of take on, and they're scary because if you it had decisive combat, and if you screwed up, you're going to lose. Whereas then they also introduced this thing. It's like, oh my god, if I have no chance, just run. But yeah, you've seen this emergence of the cat and mouse horror games.
Hmm.
And to me, I think that's hugely exciting because it's a different type of horror, and that's how you kind of, again, you're branching out, right? But I totally get what people are like. Oh, that's not for me. What drives me bananas is people are like, "Bah, that's not horror," and that was actually something that I was always leery about the horror thing, and that's part of the reason we moved into the thriller space, especially with all our updates and all that sort of thing, was because as much as I love horror, my goal was not horror first. It was about the story, about the atmosphere, about creating a creepy vibe, and something that would reflect on the story that we're trying to tell, a very personal story, and also trying to show people the things that I talked about before about echolocation and all of that.
Hmm.
And so to me as a developer and as a player, it's really exciting to see people taking things in different directions. I think that again, this is where it's important to communicate and it's important to understand. One of the things that drives me crazy is when people are like, "Well, just jump scares or stupid or whatever," and it's like, "Well, good games don't have jump scares," and it's like, okay, well let's unpack that here because really, when it comes down to it, I I'm pretty confident that every single horror game has jump scares. There's a question of whether or not they rely on it entirely or they overuse it, and that's a whole separate discussion. But I think again, let's get on the same level. Let's try and talk these things through because we're not going to make games better if people are just like. And you wouldn't believe the number of times I see it, like on YouTube or whatever. And it's like you will see comments that are literally just jump scares. Like that's it. After a 2-minute trailer, or whatever, just like jump scares. It's like, what about jump scares? Are you like, what do you say? Um, I'm always interested in the discourse, but it's a long-winded way of saying that games can mean many different things, just as horror can mean many different things. And it's interesting to see things branch out the same way we've branched out into thriller.
Hmm. Yeah. And I'm going to rattle off some horror games or some games that I
Oh,
played that have had horror in them, and I want to get your thoughts on them, Bill, if you've played them or not.
great.
So, going back to what you said a few minutes ago regarding Bioshock and kind of how you said it really wasn't designed as a horror game, it was an action game with horror elements. And
Well, honestly, it was a weird mix because
yeah,
System Shock 2, I don't know if you played it, but that kind of straddled the line, and I think that was designed with more horror in mind. Early on in Bioshock, it was more horror-y, and then we started to push it more in like, okay, we have all these cool tools, let's let people use
yeah,
them. And then towards the end, we pushed a little bit further back and tried to find the right spot where it's like, it's always a balancing act. But when you have a game with that many different elements, there's always this tension of like, oh, what's more important and where does it sit? And you establish your pillars of the game. You sort of you create all the systems and you start to put them into practice and you start to build the levels and then you start to look at the overall game and the experience. And you're saying like, oh, we have these pieces we're not using. Let's make use of them. And as you get closer and closer to the end, you're realizing that you're sort of it's this constant ebb and flow of pushing on these different systems. And then as you start to get close enough, you're like, wait a minute, okay, what are we really looking at here? Does this hold true to what the pillars that we've set? And is what we're seeing on the ground level in the actual game, is it any fun? Do we need to hold on to the pillars if it's fun here? And like, can we change the pillars or that kind of thing? Bioshock changed, back and forth all over. And there were pieces where we were like, oh, we don't need the horror, and then there was like, oh, wait, we have the horror, we should push on it more. Um, but ultimately, again, we coming back to it. There we were never going to be a straight horror game. We were never going to be a survival horror game, and I think we knew that. But it was just always flirting with it. Was where we were, I guess.
yeah. And like that reminds me when I sat for the talk Fred Renell did, who created Alone in the Dark. I think this was
Nice,
GC 2012.
nice.
He said that when they originally set out to make Alone in the Dark, there wasn't any horror at the time. He
Oh,
wanted to make an adventure game, but also wanted there to be action in there as well. And
huh.
it just sort of happened that they didn't want to make the action too powerful, so they thought, how are we going to, limit the player? Well, let's make these enemies, supernatural. Let's make
Yep.
it so you have to think about how to kill them. And it all just kind of like coalesced into survival horror.
That's awesome.
And it's like very interesting. Again, like as you said, like there's many different ways you can do horror, and the
Yep.
examples I'm going to bring up over the next few minutes, I think, are going to be evident of that.
Yep.
And I think it's very tricky when you're trying to balance these different systems. So here's
Yep.
the first question, or the first game. Alan Wake is one of those very interesting titles. Like, it originally started out, I think, a lot more on the horror aspect. When the game was
Sure.
first announced by Remedy and, like, images and screenshots, it looked very much like that Twin Peaks style,
Yep.
small town
Oh yeah, that first
somewhere.
trailer blew my
Yeah,
mind. The lighthouse one. Yeah, totally.
yeah. And
Yep.
then as we saw, the game kind of went more towards this action
Yep.
element to it. So
Yep.
I guess keeping with this idea, like what is and what isn't horror, would you
Sure.
consider Alan Wake to be a horror game, or do you think it's more or less an action game with horror elements like thrown in?
That's a great question. And my feeling, my suspicion here, and I'm talking out of my butt here, my suspicion here is that, they wanted to push more in the horror direction and, they had partners, that sort of thing. They had quite a bit invested and they wanted to make it as accessible as possible. And they probably made it more and more actiony, more accessible as possible. Because, like, when it comes down to it, this is going to offend some people, but, horror is more niche than action. Call of Duty is always going to sell more copies than Resident Evil. It's just the way it is. And those that's comparing apples to oranges. I realize, but so I suspect that they push more on accessible and more on action. But definitions, it's not as interesting to me. I mean, I guess I would agree that it's probably more action adventure with horror elements. But ultimately, it is what it is. That's what's important to me. Is I like to look at games like I think it only becomes a problem when someone's like, "Oh, buy this horror game," and you buy the horror game expecting a horror game, and it's like, "Yeah, but it has guns or it has whatever thing, however you define a horror game, it doesn't gel with that, and that's where it's a problem. I think it's important to talk about the experience, and that's why the caveat's interesting to me when you say it's a action adventure game with horror elements.
Mm-hmm.
That's lights are possessed. Yeesh. I didn't do that. Speaking of horror, um, so yeah, I think nuance is important.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think you bring up an interesting point that it probably did change. You
Yeah.
know,
And it's always interesting. Ooh, we're getting it nice and pink in there.
that was me. Yeah, yeah. I'm feeling a little bit pinkish.
Like it's very interesting. Again, like I would love to have seen what they were originally planning with Alan Wake.
Yeah.
Like I have on the game with some site like a design doc for my dream horror idea, and over the
Oh,
last few years I thought of another idea. I would love like I've always had this idea in my head for like an open world style horror game where like the entire town is kind of like possessed or haunted and you're
sure.
trying to figure things out and then what you do kind of pushes back against the town.
Yeah.
Like I had this like vision in my head for like one situation where if you go too far, basically you run into the situation like in I think it's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers where you're walking in town like everyone's just like staring at you and you're like something's not right here and like everyone just like immediately like creatures possessed will like come at you without you realizing it. Like if you go too far, you push back, and
Sure.
they know that you know that something's wrong, kind of thing.
Sure.
But
Okay. No, it sounds super cool, and again, looking at I love Remedy.
mhm,
I was super excited about their initial trailer. I mean, like one of my favorite trailers, where it's that sort of shining style camera flying over the pines, the sort of upper northwest, Pacific Northwest pines, and it's text, all this sort of stuff, and then you come to the lighthouse, and it gets really dark, and it's like, oh, when the sun sets, shit's gonna go down, and you have the Alan Wake character running across oh, it did it again. Oof. Running across the bridge, and you have these people in cowls coming after you, and I was like, I want to play that game,
yeah,
and it made sold the open world, it sold the Twin Peaks thing, and then for whatever reason it changed.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, no, it sounds like what you're talking about sounds like a cool idea. I think horror is tough. Generally speaking, I think horror needs to be less systemic and more crafted.
mhm,
I think the more you have a much easier time when it's you, very carefully paced out and kind of hand-holdy on the design side. Because when you let people control things, when you let people control their own experience, they have the ability to make it a whole lot less scary.
Yeah.
And this is part of the reason why you talk about Resident Evil, you talk about Silent Hill, where they have those stupid tank controls. You know, that helps a lot because it makes the player vulnerable, but it also helps you corral them and control them a lot better, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have free movement, especially in first person is great for horror because it's more immersive and you're in the perspective, right? You feel more vulnerable, you feel more invested, but it's also a lot easier to misbehave. It's a lot easier to look away and miss the thing that you need to see, the little quick flash of someone walking down the hall. So it's all about trade-offs when you create horror games like this. But the footnote here is, and I'm no way trying to poo-poo what you're saying, but you talk about open world and systemic, that's a challenge for horror.
Oh yeah, definitely. And as you said, like it requires a very different thought process when you're designing a game like that, because
Yep.
I think, my goodness, it's like its own topic, like it's a topic within a topic. But like, as you said, like the power that you're giving the player really has to be controlled. Because as
Yep.
you said, we could go in two completely different ends of the spectrum. You can have here's a perfect case in point: Doom 2016. Doom
Yep.
2016 could be a horror game. You're on Mars fighting demons from hell,
Yep.
but everything about that game is controlled not to be horror. And
Yep.
I wrote a piece about this last year that like the Doom guy was like one of like the most expressive like video game characters we saw that year. By the fact that he didn't say a damn word, it was just
Yep.
him like how he reacted to the situation. And like when it comes to, like the other end, you can have games like Outlast, Perception, and the like where the character is not meant to fight, but at the same time, you always have that challenge of how much do you give the player? Like as you said, you give the player a shotgun, they're going to feel like a badass. I mean, I
Yep.
go back to like Evil Dead 2, like the moment when Ash gets the chainsaw and boomstick and
Yep.
says,
Yep.
"Oh, I can't let I forget the phrase right now. That's perfect. It's getting late for me." But we all know what it is.
That's my boomstick,
Yeah,
shop at smart, shop at
yeah.
smart, the whole thing. Yeah. Love it.
Hmm.
Love that movie.
Oh yeah, and like it completely changes. It basically changes things. I mean, we see this as you said with Bioshock. Like you start that game out, or there's Groovy. It just popped into my head. But like with Bioshock, you start out. You're in this underwater place. The whole city around you is like sinking. It's dark. It's
Yep.
misery, and you're like, oh my god, what's going on? Then
Yep.
20 minutes in the game, you have a pistol. You can shoot electricity out of your hands. You can hack
Yep.
turrets and have them on your side. And you
Yep.
said by the halfway point, you're given like an entire toy box of crazy abilities.
Yep.
And then at that point, it's like, yeah, you can introduce monsters, but I have shotgun lightning powers. How am I supposed to feel scared at that point?
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. One of the key elements of horror is, in fact, making the player vulnerable,
Hmm.
and a lot of cases making it so that combat is decisive. And so, in the case of Bioshock, you had all these resources, so you're not that vulnerable. You had a lot of health packs, gene tonics, all this sort of thing. And then on top of that, we wanted to keep people playing the game, keep people in the experience, keep people into the story, and not have an excuse for them to shut the game off because we really wanted to get them to the would you kindly moment. And so something like the Vita Chambers, if you die in the game, it's like boom, you're right there. It's tough to keep tension. I would argue impossible to keep tension when you're running around. You can blast anyone in the face with a shotgun, but then also if you get blasted in the face with a shotgun, you're right back there.
Yeah.
And so it's about trade-offs. You can create some of the feeling and the elements of horror, the atmosphere, and that sort of thing. And for a lot of people, it works. Especially not to say this as a disparaging comment at all, but especially with lower skill players who aren't as good at shooters. That any given splicer can be, could be the difference between life and death in a game. Whereas a lot of like hardcore shooter players are just kind of like, whatever, dude, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also, as you said earlier, with the tank-like controls, it kind of becomes an equalizer in that point of
Yep.
view.
Yeah.
Because
Yep.
both expert and non-expert players are going to struggle with those controls just the same. Like,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
still a limiting factor no matter what the person's original skill level is.
I hadn't thought of that. You're absolutely right. It is an equalizer. Yeah, I've thought about it all these other different ways, but you're absolutely right that it does. Yeah, wow, that's interesting.
Thank you. We have a question in chat, but you brought up a really strong topic that I want to touch on when you mentioned the Vita chambers.
Sure.
And that's another big part about horror, and that's the punishment factor. As you said, with Bioshock, you
Yep.
die, you get sent back to that checkpoint. I know, God only knows how many times I did that when fighting a Big Daddy. And with a lot of horror games, we see different aspects of that. Like in Amnesia, I can get killed 500 times trying to get past an enemy. There's no real punishment there. I
Yep.
go back a previous room, we repeat it. But
Yep.
then there are games like Five Nights at Freddy's
Yep.
or Outlast where
Yep.
there are hard checkpoints where if
Yep.
I die, I'm going way back. So the question I want to ask you, Bill, like, is there like an acceptable form of punishment when it comes to horror games? Because obviously with action games, it's a different story.
Yep.
There are set points that we have to get through. We mentioned like Call of Duty in chat earlier. There are, if we don't get to the end of that level, we're going back to a checkpoint. That's fine.
Sure.
But how do you do something like that with a controlled experience like horror?
This is that's a great question, and it's actually why I don't like when we carefully compartmentalize and
Mm-hmm.
define things. I think it's important to look at a game for what it is, and to look at the experience that the creators are trying to create, and to look at the way that gamers are receiving it, and to look at the way, you know. I think it's critical to consider authorial intent, and I think that if we were to create definitions and say like, oh, the way to there are certainly best practices, but every game is so different. It's not like movies from one movie to the next is always obviously going to be very different, but you know even comparing uh, you know Freddy Krueger with Michael Myers, they're worlds apart. Like the rules for the universe that Freddy operates in, where it's the dream world that anything can go, versus Michael Myers, where obviously he's super invincible killer man, who can't die or whatever. Um, but he doesn't have magical powers. He can just take a hanger or a gun bullet to the face and get back up. Whereas Freddy, it's just like anything goes. So, again, rule sets, I think they have to be consistent. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And I think you have to consider, carefully a number of different factors. You have to consider what the player is going to look for in your experience and what they're going to value. And if it's a narrative game, if you are making a narrative horror game, you have to consider the fact that if if you're going to knock someone out of the experience and make them replay it, well, that means they're going to have to experience the same story, elements over and over again, and possibly not necessarily a cutscene, but repeat some VO, repeat some dialogue or a note or however you're delivering the story, and that's going to get grading. If it's a systemic game, again like Bioshock, where it's about combat and that sort of thing. You get killed, you get knocked back, and you get right back out. In a lot of ways, part of what I like, and this is, oh man, just a lot of inspirations here, but obviously it was ripped directly out of System Shock 2 when I was pitching it to the design team and to Ken and everyone, being like, listen, System Shock 2 had what I thought was the perfect system for the perfect death penalty in a game of this type, because we want people to experiment. We want people to get through the story and to experience it, and to not stop playing, having not gotten to the "would you kindly" moment, right? And so we very carefully considered what our priorities were, and priorities were, hey, we want people to whip out the electro bolt and try and set up a combo where they can shock a guy in water, and then they're going to pick up a toggle over to electro bolt and use a toggle over to telekinesis and pull over the explosive barrel and throw it at the guy and do all this crazy stuff, right? They're not going to do that if when they die, they have to replay a whole mess, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it didn't make sense for us. And that's where, you have that ebb and flow that I was talking about. Okay, what is the role of horror? What is the role of experimentation? And all the pillars we talked about. And so for BioShock, even though it's kind of not really a horror game, it has horror elements. That's that the one of the easiest things we could have done to make it more horror-y is we could have limited the resources, limited the information by making the game darker, and make it so that the combats are more decisive. And then when you die, hey, guess what? You go back to the main menu and you have to replay a bunch. But you know what? That would have sucked because when did people stop playing a game? Right? When they get stuck. When they die, they lose progress. They don't know where they're going next. That's irrefutably where people stop playing. They don't make people don't stop playing games when they're making good progress.
Yeah.
And so you consider all these things, and you come up with a concoction that's right for you, the experience you want. And so I think generally speaking, for most traditional horror games, you have it so that when you die, you have to go back to some goofy checkpoint system you created, or reload. Whether it's the silly little typewriters in Resident Evil, whatever save point you created yourself, you're sort of creating as much rope as you want to hang yourself with, which is interesting in its own way. Or, you have some sort of arbitrary checkpoint that designers set up, and then when I continue, I'm going to have to suffer the pain of, okay, I just lost some time. What did I lose? I have to go back and collect this thing, and guess what? I'm going to bounce. I'm done playing. So yeah, it's a careful bit of alchemy, I guess.
Yeah. Here's the question from earlier. Also, I was asking, have you had a chance to play Resident Evil 7 yet, and do you have any thoughts on it?
I'm a terrible person. So I haven't played it yet.
Me neither.
I played the demo,
Yeah.
Which I thought was exceptional. It's only it was like 20 minutes or whatever. So I'm super excited. I love the series. Resident Evil 1 and 4 are two of my favorite games of all time, and I'm dying to play it. It's been so short on time because of Perception and family and all the updates and all that sort of thing. Just getting all the awesome feedback and continuing to make the game better. But it's at the top of my list. I'm trying to get caught up in this year, and so I just started playing Zero Dawn. Wow, Horizon. What a terrible name that is. Can we just talk about what a terrible name Horizon
Yes.
Zero Dawn is? I hope that there's an explanation why they called it that, because it's nonsense. So playing that, Assassin's Creed. Playing. I'm still playing a little bit of Mario Odyssey, just again, spare time kind of thing. And I started a couple other games like an idiot at the same time, but I'm waiting I want to play it with Amanda, and sit down and actually give it a chunk of time. I'm psyched. I hear great things.
Yeah.
Right? Good stuff, right?
Yeah, I haven't played it either. I played the demo just like you. But yeah, Resident Evil 4 is, I still consider one of my top 10 favorite games. I just love that game.
Absolutely, yeah. I was talking to someone recently about how it may not read this way, but man, that was a big inspiration and influence for me and for the design team in particular, or I should say for me in particular, but for the design team on BioShock. There were countless discussions that we had about the systems in that game and sort of trying to pick and choose, because for a long time, we looked very closely. The goal was to take a lot of the core elements of System Shock 2 and bring them to current gens, bring them to so they would work on consoles and work on PC, but with modern sensibilities, because it was 8 or 10 years later. And so we looked very carefully, because for the longest time I was like, oh, games don't have inventories anymore, and all of a sudden Resident Evil came out and it had the whole the Tetris inventory, and we're like, oh, okay, maybe we should. Obviously we didn't, but I think one of the better achievements that the game pulled off was it's surprisingly sandboxy. There's a lot of really interesting arenas, like that first village you come into, where you have all this freedom to go into one building and kind of board it up, and then go upstairs and jump out the window, and then they start putting up the ladder and trying to climb in with you and all that. Like, what an amazingly responsive playground that was.
Oh, yeah.
And so we look very closely at that in a lot of ways. looked at it in terms of the way the AI behaved, and just one of my all time favorites for sure.
Hmm. And that kind of, again, like how the AI kind of matched the player. This was an example I was going to bring up just yet, but I really enjoy the idea of the alien and alien isolation and how
Oh, okay,
it
yeah,
actively went against the player. Like I remember seeing like I think it was like Gama Sutra piece where the alien kind of half knows where you are and then half kind of has to deduct it.
yep,
But
yep,
that was to me was just a real like watershed moment
yep,
of oh my goodness, we actually have an antagonist who's actively against the player.
yep.
And like I would love to see like after playing I would love to see someone actually try and make a game like Nightmare on Elm Street or
Oh,
something
man.
like Friday the 13th where you actually have a serial killer trying to get you like that.
Yep, absolutely. I- the I think it helps when it's non-human for sure.
Mhm. Mhm.
Alien was a huge one of my favorites as well. We looked at it very closely for perception, and like we wound up again going more thriller, and we looked very closely at the alien there to find the right balance for the presence, and ultimately we very similar to what we do in Bioshock, where it was like we really wanted to make sure people got through the story to see how all the narrative threads tie together. Um, but man, oh man, I'm with you. Like that is, I think, the same way the Nemesis. I think it's important to build up this sort of prolonged tension, but that a lot of that comes from a relationship that you build. You
Yeah.
talked before about the characters and building characters in horror. That's important.
Yeah.
Um, I honestly don't know that you can do it without that kind of rivalry. I mean,
Mhm.
I think Fatal Frame, I guess the first Resident Evil are two examples
Mhm.
of horror where you don't really have a specific face of
Yeah.
the enemy. It's sort of like Resident Evil works because it's the generic zombies and they're
Yeah.
everywhere. It's about infestation, and I guess by extension, so is Fatal Frame.
Yeah.
But it really does help to have that looming tension of the Jack Torrance
Mhm.
out lurking.
Yeah, like Fatal Frame 3, they did actually have like the head spirit or like the whatever the main ghost was kind of like chasing you in throughout kind of thing. But yeah,
Yep.
you're right. Like Fatal Frame 1, like they're like the house itself or like that. I'm not sure if it was like a shrine or like a mansion was like the enemy there.
Yep.
But yeah, like it, like as we said before, like with like a lot of '80s horror, it really
Yep.
came down to like what you saw the enemy or what you saw that antagonist was doing.
Yep.
Like that reminded me, like I actually have a third like horror idea. I've never even like thought about writing this one down, where you're being basically chased by like a demon throughout this town, and the demon is basically like bound to you, like he needs to kill you to like complete this contract, so he will show up at random points or when you least suspect it, and you have to
Right.
figure out how to get away from him or do something to stop him momentarily. But basically you're cursed, so he's just going to keep coming back and in new forms and new ways to basically screw with you kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah, that was something I came up with like a while ago, but like that idea of having like a personality to the enemy. Like it's not just as you said, like going back to what we were talking about earlier with like the power dynamic. One of the things that kills like I think a lot of horror is when you're fighting nondescript enemies and it becomes routine. Like I
Yep.
mentioned this with Dead Space. The first time you fight a xenomorph, it's a scary experience.
Yep.
When you fought that same enemy type 50, 60 times in a row,
Yep.
it's like I know what I'm doing, rinse and repeat.
Yep. Well, I think that's why two was really effective in that they,
Mhm.
when you start to get bored of one archetype, they introduce a new one. Like the sprinters, those ones that kind of hide and then jump out at you and run. Whereas they were very samey. They did have different types in Dead Space One. Um, but the enemies ultimately came off as very samey, whereas in two, as you start to get comfortable and set in with the feeling that you're talking about, they would shake things up quite a bit with a whole new enemy. And they also did, I think, a pretty good job of um, making it more of a faced. There
Yeah.
wasn't a particular enemy. There was the cultists or whatever, but yeah, I thought two did a much better job with the horror in this regard.
Yeah. And as a complete random tangent I was thinking about, I would love to see more games adopt the Nemesis system from
Oh
Shadow
my god.
Horror. I think that could work perfectly with horror, like thinking
Yep.
about it.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
that could be like an hour and a half right there. We start talking about that. But trying to get somewhat back on topic because let me see, what is our time? Wow, we're almost at 2 hours, and I feel like we could keep going. But yeah, there's still more I want to get to. We'll see how long we go before we both just like falling asleep at our keyboard.
I'm
Then
getting a little fried, I'll be honest. So yeah, let's see how it goes. But yeah,
yeah,
I can see my eyes starting to glaze over, and I'm
yeah.
like I said, it's
So
been a long day.
I know. All right, so I think let me get to at least the two examples I want to bring up regarding horror, and
Cool.
then we'll see how things go. And again, I am more than happy to have you back on, Bill, either for a live or recorded talk, because this has been
Happy
great.
to be on. Great.
So the second game I want to touch on is Condemned. And I think this
Oh,
is a
cool.
very interesting one. Did you have a chance to play either one or two?
Both actually, not two as much. I played
Mm-hmm.
one. So I actually hold on. I'm trying to remember which one I played more of, but one of them I didn't finish. But they're both really fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that they hit on a lot of the core horror. They have like they said, very decisive combat.
Mm-hmm.
It's they. I feel dirty having beaten you with that pipe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there's that bear scene in part one of Condemned where it's like you gotta fucking run from this bear. And
I think
again,
that may be Condemned 2, if I remember. The bear that you're being
my
chased in, like, when you're
okay,
up, like, in Canada or Alaska or something like that.
sure, sure. But
But,
yeah, no, exceptional series. They do a lot of really great things. I think it's one of those experiences where it's probably a little bit longer than it should have been. I think if it
yeah,
were released today, it would be more impactful because it probably would have been shorter and tighter.
yeah,
But yeah, fantastic game.
yeah. And again, another one of my favorites, not just for horror, but just in games in general. And the reason why I wanted to bring that up, because as you said, it has very decisive combat. And I thought to me that was a really good example, again, of that power dynamic. That you are you're beating the living crap out of everyone that gets in your way, but it's not the same kind of feel as when you're using a railgun in Dead Space or the shotgun in Resident Evil. Like there's that grittiness to it that I
Yep.
felt that a lot more horror games could use. I think to me, I think Condemn, I think really ruined Outlast for me when I think about it. Because in Outlast, you're running past all these various instruments. I was like, wait, there's a freaking cleaver on this wall
Yeah.
here. Why
Yeah.
can't I just pick this up and like I don't need to be a military, a master of martial arts to pick up a cleaver and throw it at someone.
Yeah. Totally.
And that's
It's
one of the
tricky.
things. Yeah, and again, like that's one of the things again with that power dynamic with Condemn that it does a really good job of that kind of tension and release. Like that's oh my goodness, that's another 30 minutes tacked onto this talk. But being able to get that buildup of tension and releasing it is critical towards horror. And as you said earlier, it goes back to that crafted nature. Like you really need to be in control as a designer over the horror experience. Or as you said, the player can just go nuts. Like, I'll give you the perfect example of that. In Condemned 2, there is a scripted event in a bathroom. I think this was like the second or third chapter in. That you
Yeah.
go in, you open up the supply closet, and there's health. And an enemy will spawn immediately behind you. And it's supposed to be a jump scare when you turn
Yeah.
around.
Yeah.
What I
Yeah.
did was, I walked in, and I walked in backwards. So I was facing that door. So when I hit that trigger, the guy just like popped into the space. I'm like, yeah, how scared are you? Knocked him out right then and there. But like that, there's a great point again about how much rope do you give the player?
Yep.
Like, and that goes, I think, with Condemned 2. Like, I felt they went a little too far away from horror. Like, it got a lot more about gun-based combat,
Yep.
and then it
Yep.
just becomes another first-person shooter.
Well,
Like,
this is the problem that you're reaching at again. I think that you're always going to try and capitalize on your investment, and so horror is niche, and that's why I think horror is so popular in the indie space is because it's a popular enough genre, but it's also a relatively inexpensive genre because you don't have to create the same number of assets. But yeah, when you create the first one, you get enough of a following, but you want to grow that. You need to grow that audience, and frankly, one of the ways that you saw this, Resident Evil 4 found a brilliant balance, and they where it was like action but also horror, and they had to push the action even more because they're trying to grow the audience, and then you saw it sort of reached its pinnacle with 6, where people got pretty pissy about the fact that it was so actiony,
Hmm.
and then they pulled back and they were
Yeah.
like, "Oh, we're going to go straight horror." And I think at that point with 6 they had damaged the brand a little bit, and I think they probably won quite a bit of it back with 7.
Yeah.
Um, at some point you're serving none of your masters, but there's always going to be that trying to move it a little bit and find how far you can push it to grow the audience, right?
Yeah. And I think another thing Condemned did really well, that power dynamic, was that you really didn't fight a lot of enemies at the same time. Like, the
Yep.
counters were maybe like 1 to 2. I know there were a few arena fights here and there, but it never got to like crazy numbers. Like,
Yep. Yep.
um, something like the Evil Within, for instance. Like, you start that game, when you get to the first village, you're fighting
Yep.
like 15, 20 guys.
I couldn't get past the first couple of rooms. I didn't like the first one at all. Kind of hated
Uh,
it. It was
I.
like I don't like gore, number one,
Mhm.
but it was also like in the first couple of rooms in that meat
The stealth,
whatever
yeah.
slaughterhouse. It was really poorly guided,
Hmm.
and I died a bunch of times where I felt really really cheap, and it was just like, what, if this is the very, like, you spend most of your time as a developer in the first, the very beginning of the game,
Oh,
the first
yes.
levels, right? And it's like, if you can't corral people to through your experience at that point, I lose faith, and I'm just like, what, this is not my worth of my time. So I've heard good things. Again, those 2 strikes, I was like, I'm done. But I
Hmm.
hear part 2 is fantastic.
Yeah, I haven't played part 2 yet, but hopefully I will at some point, and I'll join you with Resident Evil Resident Evil 7 at that point too.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm thinking if there's anything else about Condemned. Oh, one thing that I thought was really interesting was the investigation
yep.
part
It's
of that
cool.
system, and I mean, that again, that's probably a little too much of a tangent for tonight, because I know we are getting late here. I don't want to keep you all night long, but
I know, right?
um, I guess one other game before I get to the final example. The hot game, of course, Five Nights at Freddy's. Have you had a chance to play that? And do you have any
I
thoughts
have.
on it?
I think it's a brilliant design. I think
Hmm.
that there's some. It's one of those games as a developer that makes you kind of punch yourself and say, "This is so stupidly simple,"
I know.
which is a good thing. Um, and it's just such good design on so many different levels. I mean, it's so tight and so
Hmm.
focused, and it touches on. It's important, with any kind of horror. You have to have cultural connections, and it does such a great job making those shortcuts to Chuck E. Cheese and these things that
Um,
are near universal, and that are sort of universally creepy.
I'll give you
And
points on that, definitely. I agree 100%.
yeah, and then they, again, the mechanics itself. I think they lend themselves brilliantly to horror, but also from a production standpoint, there's not a whole lot of content.
Yes,
They did so much,
with very
or he
little.
did so much with so little.
Yes.
And so again, Scott, brilliant work. I've only played the first 2, which obviously he's cranked out, what, 6 now. Uh,
Yeah.
but he's obviously done very well, and I think he deserves it because it's really really smart work. It's a very marketable game. It's a very universally appealing game. It hits on all, right place, right time, man. Well done.
Hmm. And like the latest one just came out, I think, the other night. That's free, and
It's very
that
real.
one actually has. Well, I'm not going to say it's like an in-depth game, but there's actually, I think, a little bit more meat to it than the
Huh?
previous titles,
Really?
which is very interesting. Again, I can't. It's one of those games where if we talk about, we're spoiling it for everyone, so we can't go too far into
Okay,
it.
I'll check it out. It's cool.
Yeah, I think it's a Fazbear's Pizza Simulator. That's the latest one, something like that.
Okay, I did see a screenshot. Yeah, it kind of looks like Tapper.
Hmm. So I know we are definitely over 2 hours. So here's the last game, the last
Cool.
game example I want to bring up. And for those of you watching this live right now, this will be, I guess, last call for horror-related questions before we go. But the game that I want to bring up is, I'm not sure, this is one that I may stump you on, Bill, but Rule of Rose. Did you ever
Oh,
hear of
okay, cool.
that one?
Heck yeah. No, I definitely I
Ah,
dig it. I dig it because it does some. I like the weird, obscure horror games for
yeah.
sure. They take. I feel like they take more chances. Oh, we just did it again. That's. I can change it with my phone, and sometimes it just changes on its own. Well, I'm gonna change it back right now. I like the blue. So yeah, that was a good. That was a really interesting game. Not quite as overtly scary as it was sort of fairy tale weird,
Hmm.
which for me, again, it's the kind of game that's never gonna like find a huge audience, and that's fine. Again, it took a lot of, I think, interesting chances, but I always like the sort of the fairy tale horror where it's about being lost and out of place and fish out of water, and like there are parts of Alice in Wonderland that to me are some of the most like I don't know if you've seen Alice in Wonderland, the original one,
Yeah.
Disney, right?
Hmm.
There's that one scene where she's in the woods and she starts crying because she's lost, and she's on that path, and then that fucking dog, excuse me, that dog comes along and sweeps up the path
Hmm.
and leaves her stranded in the middle of nowhere, and it's like that's genuinely terrifying when you think about it. And there are elements of Rule of Rose that struck me as reminiscent of that. But yeah, a good game, and I think it's much more sort of fairy tale horror.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you touch on a really good point there regarding that kind of situation. Like the reason why I brought up was that one of my favorite kinds of horror, like Rule of Rose, is when it's not like the end of the world kind of situation. I really like the personal horror. Like
Yep,
going
yep,
back to what you said with Silent Hill 2 earlier, the
yep,
story of James Sunderland, it's not him trying to save the universe from the
yeah,
Icon or whatever it was from Dead Space or saving the president's daughter in Resident Evil. Like if James dies, nothing really happens. Like the
yeah,
world doesn't end,
yep,
nobody goes on, but it becomes a more of a personal story about figuring out who that character is. And I
yep,
think the same could be said of I forget her name, whoever the main character was from War Rose. But
yep,
again, it's a story, as you said, it's kind of like you enter this other world and you're forced
yep,
to play by its rules,
yep,
and you're just kind of like as you said, a stranger in a strange land. Like to me, like this is another point you mentioned earlier regarding rules. I always am a big fan of, like when games or when even like movies or TV shows have their own internal rule set that they follow,
yep,
and trying to like figure out, okay, how are they going to get out of this given that the world is built on X, Y, and Z kind of
yep,
thing.
yep. I mean, honestly, these are all pieces that we tried to imbue with perception. I think we tried to create our own rule set. And we tried to put you. It's much more of a personal tale, and it is much more of a again thriller. But I've always said that it's much more like it's much more Kubrickian, like a Stanley Kubrick film, or not to sound pretentious, or uh, you look at The Shining, you
Mm-hmm.
look at the horror elements there. Yeah, there are jump scares or whatever, but if you look carefully at the way that's created, most of it bucks horror.
Mm-hmm.
Like most of the scenes are shot pretty bright. There's almost
Yeah.
no dark scenes in that movie, and you can kind of see everything. But it's much more about like what lurks around the corner and like this sort of like really dense and pregnant pauses where you hold these really long still shots of the characters who are plastic but kind of broken and they could snap at any moment. That it's mostly an exercise in tension.
Yeah.
That's the space I like to operate in, or I wanted to anyway with perception. I think some extension. Rule of Rose is that way as well, where it's about you filling in the blanks a little bit rather
Yeah.
than you sort of. And that's why I don't like gore. It's like when you see the blood and the guts on, it, it's like okay, there it is.
Mm-hmm.
Gross, I guess.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I'd rather hear that. I'd rather hear the gore than see it.
Mm-hmm. And like speaking about like a world, I know Rule of Rose. They did like there was like extensive amount talking about like the lore and the background for that game. I remember
Cool.
reading like a blog post, like someone detailed all the inspiration, all the theories about Rule of Rose that I
Yep.
thought was very fascinating. And
Sure.
again, as you said, like it does a really good job of you don't need to have blood for it to be scary. Like
No.
obviously gore is a part of horror. I mean, we talk about 80s horror movies already, but as we said, like if you're just hitting the person with gore every minute, it's not really a horror movie anymore. It just becomes once it becomes routine, you lose that mystery. You lose that air of where am I, what's going on kind of
Right.
feel.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, yeah. No. This is why I think it's important to have not so stringent definitions, and it's
Mhm.
important to be able to say horror can mean many different things. And I think the genre, and I think games and movies, and they're better when we're able to try new things like that, right?
Mhm.
Because, geez, strictly by definition, something like Rule of Rose, or maybe even Silent Hill 2, these things shouldn't exist if you went strictly by the definition. Certainly, Rule of Rose.
Mhm.
But if we, Resident Evil 4 is definitely horror, but if we said, oh, well, yeah, it's horror, but it's not really because of X, Y, or Z, there are
Mhm.
definitely, if you put it up to the same sort of scrutiny that we do with some titles, it probably wouldn't hold up, even though it
Yeah.
clearly is. I mean, I think games are more than the sum of their parts.
Mhm. All right. I have one final question for you, Bill, and that
Cool.
will be it for me for tonight. Again, we could stay here for another 2, 3 hours. Like it's nothing. So, for you
Amen.
folks watching this live right now, again,
Thank you.
warning, warning. If you have any questions, please get them in. But here's my last one, and this is, I think, a tricky one. One of the hardest parts about horror, as we've talked about, is sustaining it or keeping it going.
Yeah.
And we've talked about so far within a game itself, be it, throughout Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and the like. But
Yep.
one of the things that we also saw is very hard is doing it over a series. We've, of course, mentioned 80s horror, and as we've seen, the quality of a lot of those horror franchises definitely dips as we get to, 5th, 6th,
Yep.
7th. I don't even
Yep.
know how many Hellraiser is up to at this point. I think they're up to like 9 or 10.
Sure.
But I guess, do you think it's possible to sustain horror over the same series, like in terms of iterations? Like you mentioned earlier with Resident Evil, of course, like Resident Evil 1 and 4 are Hallmark classics, but 5 and 6 aren't looked at as favorably. And it
Sure.
basically caused a complete redefinition or
Right.
redefining that with 7.
Yep. Well, I think one of the problems you have with any sequel, whether it's horror or otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
there's an expectation that you're going to take things further, that you're going to double down, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you go from Resident Evil 1 to 2. The big change there was we're going to do more. We're going to do more enemies on the screen at the same time. We're going to do the lickers and all these different new types of enemies. But it still relatively kept it. They basically they kept the two playable characters on this, but they sort of upped the ante enough, but not quite. And then with 3, they had the Nemesis. They had, I think, even more zombies and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But again, I think what you see is that you run into the pitfall. And I think Resident Evil did a pretty good job up until 4, where they essentially effectively reinvented the franchise at 4. But the first 3, they did a pretty good job because they didn't, follow the usual formula of most sequels where it's double down, double down, double down. And before you know it, it's just like you get exhausted, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can go too far with these things. You can take ideas too far, and people just get exhausted and they ignore it. And so I think that what's most important if you're going to succeed here is about to look very carefully at what people love about it, and not just simply say I'm going to double down on it, but how can I take the spirit of that and put a different twist on it? Because ultimately, the old saying is they want the same but different, right? You
Mm-hmm.
talk about movie sequels, they want the same movie but different, right? And so, whether there are countless examples of basically taking the same sort of ideas that you see in one movie and then translate that to an entirely different IP. For example, Resident Evil, they took it and they doubled down. They sort of increased things a little bit for 2, and then for 3 a little bit more, and then 4 they reinvented. And then with 5, they had to take the idea of 4, and they could have just basically had it set in a different location. They could have had some new types of enemies on it, but they decided to double down. We're going to go co-op, and we're going to go more actiony, and we're going to double down on the actiony elements and pare down. And I get there were reasons they were trying to expand the audience, and then with that they even had to go even further with 6. They doubled down on that concept even more, and then okay, time to scrap it. You can see where the formula for Resident Evil is like increase, 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 relaunch, right? And that's what they do. So, to me, the formula for Resident Evil, the same way, like you could argue, you look at something like Mega Man, that probably overstayed its welcome at 4 or 5, right? It becomes kind of like, oh, it's a little bit samey. You need to either reinvent or like shake things up enough where you have an all new mechanic, something beyond the slide or the charge or whatever. Um, so anyway, long-winded way of saying that, uh, you can take the heart of something and just shake it up enough where it's okay. This time, instead of it being in a haunted house in the Pacific Northwest, it's going to be, I don't know, up in the mountains of Tibet, or in, just change up the setting enough, change up the zone, like that you can keep it fresh. But it's a tricky balancing act. You got to look at every title differently. It's one interesting because if you look at BioShock, you look at part of the reason why at Irrational we were so afraid of following it up is because we knew we'd have to, that was a tall order. But it's also like the idea of going back into Rapture was like, oh man, it's a shame because it's one of the most beloved and distinct settings, I think, in gaming. But there are a lot of people who are like, I'm going back to Rapture. And it's like, holy shit, what do you want? Like, on the one hand, you yourself are saying it's one of your favorite game settings, but you don't want to go back. Like, what is this? Like, but I partly get it because people felt that you had said the story of Rapture was told, and I get the sort of purity argument there and all that sort of thing. And I personally think that they could have done quite a bit more with the narrative and the environment of Rapture with BioShock 2. They did a great job with the sequel, particularly in the systems. They took a lot of what we built in, they just were able to improve on quite a bit, tweak quite a bit. But yeah, I do think that you can continue to till that earth with a successful horror game, and there's still a lot of, I think there's a tendency to say, oh, we got to completely double down or throw it out or restart, when there's still quite a bit more to do. I think Dead Space 1 to 2 is a great example. I think Dead Space 3 was an example where they decided, okay, we got to reinvent, we got to double down, we're going to go co-op, and we're going to go more actiony. And I get it, they're trying to recoup the costs. Again, it comes back to business. Totally get it. But having a new setting, take the elements of Dead Space 2, mix it up with some new xenomorphs or whatever they're called, a different location, maybe play around with some of the mechanics a little bit more. There's still quite a bit more they could have done for another game or two. But sometimes it's tough to tell exactly what that balance is.
Yeah. And as you said, like that kind of constant reinvention, it's always tough because as we said earlier, the fans will expect a certain element to it. So if you go too far, then you alienate them. Yep. If you don't go far enough, then they're like, I'm just playing the same exact game I played last year or the year before that.
Yep. I mean, so it all depends because you look at, Call of Duty got away with 8 iterations before anyone started to be like, wait a minute, you should do something different. Nobody questioned it. But I think it's because the core mechanics and the polish were so good that it made sense. So in a lot of ways, it's interesting because you get penalized, I think, for being distinct in a lot of ways. In the same way I was talking about with Rapture, because the environment was so distinct, it was honestly a hindrance for sequels, where it was like, it's so good that people don't want to see it again. Whereas you think about what Resident Evil is, it's much more about the sort of high-level experience in the gameplay, and what survival horror is about, scrounging together and exploring and trying to bootstrap your way through difficult situations, and being terrified of what's around the next corner and how much a simple small screw up can cost you. That's what Resident Evil is really about. And so trying to take those ideas and explore them in different ways, without, I think you get a lot of backlash as to like, oh, if it doesn't have zombies, it's not Resident Evil. And that's why Resident Evil 4 is really interesting, because they took the idea of what is a zombie? Well, it's not a virus, it's an actual insect thing that controls your mind, and so because it still felt zombie-ish or whatever, they got away with it. But man, what they took some big chances and it paid off.
Oh yes. And again, I would love to talk to you more tonight, Bill, but I know we're both starting to feel it. Uh,
Oh, right.
so
I'm trying.
here's the last question. This is one from chat. Mike was asking, "What's your favorite low-res horror game?"
Low res meaning old school, or low res meaning just sort of like indie-ish,
I'm
or you know what I'm saying?
actually not sure if Mike wants to elaborate on that. But yeah,
I'll,
I
I'll
could
try.
see it as both ways, because we've seen a few like indie, like pixel style games as well.
It's true. Gonna try and think of both actually. For it's funny because there aren't very many like old school horror games. You could argue, well, like, oh, Maniac Mansion was kind of horror, and obviously Alone in the Dark, brilliant, and wow. In a lot of ways, there are horror elements, or at least hints at horror and things like, I don't know, Mist is the furthest thing from a horror game, but some of the elements of isolation and the sort of fairy tale stuff that I was talking about, they're present there. That's not my answer at all. I just had one a second ago. Dang it.
He's referring to like old school, like PS1, DOS, N64, that
Cool.
kind of thing. But
Um,
yeah.
sure, totally. Obviously Silent Hill 1 and the Resident Evil games were huge, but those are too obvious and kind of feel like a punt. I'm trying to think of a one that really touched me that was kind of obscure. Um, Clock Tower. I really liked Clock Tower. That was really.
Mm.
It goes back to what you were saying about the rivalry thing. The guy with I forget what he was called. The guy with the giant scissors. Clock
Yeah.
Tower was kludgy but really interesting and pretty intense. Um, Dang it, I'm trying to think about if there was. I know that there are a couple PC titles that I'm forgetting. Obviously System Shock 2 is not horror, but System Shock 2 is pretty high up there, but that's not old enough. I feel like it's just too many games. Running through my PlayStation and 64 collection, there really weren't any horror games noteworthy on the 64. I feel like, uh, dang it. Um, Yeah, too many. In terms of obscure ones, I'd probably say for PlayStation One, Clock Tower is pretty high up there. If you haven't played that, you can get it reasonably cheap now. Definitely worth checking out. And I'm gonna kill myself for not remembering the any PC ones right now off the top of my head from that era. Um, Dang it. Oh, okay, so really, yeah, geez, I have one right here. Yeah, not really horror, kind of more, yeah, again, mystery adventure, but like the seventh guest for me, it's sort of that kitschy Scooby Doo horror. But man, I love that. That really left its mark on me. It was a big inspiration. And just to me, it's more about the atmosphere and the isolation, and it's goofy and it's like, ooh, it's spooky or whatever. But I adore Seventh Guest. So that honestly, given that frame of the mid to late '90s, that's probably my number one. Again, putting aside Silent Hill and Resident Evil, even though again it's not really horror. Um, it's the sort of, like I said, Scooby Doo horror. I don't know.
Right.
What's yours?
Oh, jeez. I think like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, same. In terms of like very pixel style graphics, I really liked The Last Door. It was like an indie Lovecraftian like adventure game that Oscar clued me in on from last year. I believe
Yeah.
it was published by Phoenix Point. Is that the developers of it or the publisher? Let's see. Developed by the Game Kitchen. Yeah, The Last Door. It was like a very much all pixel graphics, but had a very interesting story, very Lovecraftian in terms of like you're trying to solve why this person killed themselves, and it leads you into discovering a cult and stuff. Very much cosmic terror kind of thing.
No kidding.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Mike's mentioning Phantasmagoria. I have not played the
Ah,
Seventh Guest or wait. I think I downloaded Phantasmagoria because I got off of
good
GOG,
stuff. It's
but
good stuff, man. I dig it.
I have not played Seventh Guest yet. I know that for sure. Maybe I'll have to see if I have that on GOG at some point.
I think it's on GOG. Yeah, you should definitely gotta check it out. It's like, again, it's very it's simpler puzzles. than missed. But I just adore that early CG graphics look, and it's got that all the FMV goofiness, and it's a joy. Like I managed to track down a fairly recently a at a random flea market or whatever. I found a
Nice.
brand new copy, and that completely made my day. Because man, oh man, I mean, I don't know if you can see, but let's get a bit of reflection there. But it's so good. It's so cheesy. Um, that is a fave.
Oh man, I still have my Big Daddy figurine around, and I could pull that one out too.
I got a bunch of random uh,
Hmm.
stuff in here, including one of our presents statues. This is one of our Kickstarter backer rewards that
Nice.
Rob Waters had created. It's kind of cool. You can see all that if you look closely. He did really good with the detail. I don't know if you can see, but there's all kinds of little moths
Awesome.
or whatever, and like you can see the sort of moth cowl.
I
Um,
need I need more crazy figurines in my collection. Like all I have is like the Big
right?
Daddy figurine. I had the Geralt bus from The
My
Witcher.
my cousin-in-law made this. Knitted this. Thought that was really cool. Love to see what people create.
Hmm. I know Sandy Pearson and Pearson Games. I would love like some of his like their Lovecraftian figurines for Cthulhu Wars. Like they had like these
Nice.
giant ones of Cthulhu and the Elder Gods. Yeah,
Oh wow.
if any developers want to send me free figurines, I would not be against it. I tried to pressure Greg Johnson. I talked to him about Toe Jam and Earl the Revival. Like they were doing
Yeah.
figurines of the Toe. Like I would really like a few of those. If you get any extra, just send them my way.
Yeah, right?
He
Exactly,
wasn't.
yeah. And I'm the same way. My collection has gotten a bit out of hand, so I'm trying to peel back a little bit. But yeah, it's a lot of good swag out there now.
Oh yeah. But before we turn this into the Game Wisdom Home Shopping Network of our toys here, I think we better wrap this up.
I know, right? Seriously.
But
Um,
I guess to end things on, do you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to say about horror, perception, or anything else?
Honestly, no. Other than it's an exciting time, and it's I'm psyched to see horror mean all these different things, and that's important. I think the industry is growing. We're seeing all kinds of interesting new ideas, and as a developer, it's extremely helpful to get feedback and to have these kind of discussions. And you look at um, we added a couple new modes based on feedback. For example, there were a lot of people who were into the story and liked the atmosphere, but didn't want to be hunted by the presence. That thing I just showed you,
Mm-hmm.
and so we created that mode, the story mode that let people play the game without having to be hunted by the presence. And by the same token, we created a mode that made the presence more aggressive and increase the penalty for death. And so it's all based on hopping into streams and watching people play and getting comments and feedback and that sort of thing. So it's just an exciting time to be a gamer and to be a developer. And I think it's important to open the doors and to get people talking. It's really
Uh,
exciting.
awesome. And again, Bill, it has been an absolute pleasure hanging out with you this evening. I need to get
Same.
my own lighting system now. Now I'm jealous. Not just of all the cool figurines, but now I need my own mood lighting here for the
it's
streams.
This got me through intense crunch. Just sort of like you start to feel dragging on, and you can set the lights to high energy and help you focus. Yeah, no, this is a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. Thanks everyone for joining us. This is I love doing this, so thank you.
Yeah, and like I say, if you're free in the future, I would love to have you back again. So many more topics we can touch on. I mean,
Totally.
we're almost at 2.5 hours, and it feels like we just barely
Woo,
got started.
woo,
And
I know, right?
I know, but yeah, it has been great, and definitely the best of luck with Perception on the Switch and whatever you have planned next.
Yeah, totally. That's yeah, we're a little ways off, and we're still making tweaks to perception based on feedback and that sort of thing. I'm just psyched to be again being in a time when we can continue to 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 interact with people and to make the game better. But yeah, it's gonna exciting things up ahead.
Awesome. So, with that said, we are going to end things here for tonight. Again, like I said, if Bill is free in the future, we can certainly have you back on, and who knows what
Oh,
we'll talk about next time.
yes. Thank you so much.
Not a problem. If you wouldn't mind hanging on Skype for like 1 minute after we cut the recording or the stream, I just want to ask you a
Sure.
few post chat related questions. For
Sure.
those of you watching this either live or recorded, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to check out Perception on PC, Switch. It is available on any other platforms.
PS4 and Xbox One, baby. Woo.
Awesome. Be sure to check that out. And for those of you watching this recorded, if you would like to get access to an ad-free version of the stream, be sure to check out patreon.com/gwbeister. As $1 or more gets you into our Discord channel and voting, $5 or more gets you ad-free versions of all these lovely discussions we have. So be sure to check that out. For those of you watching this live, I do have an idea for a little game stream later this evening. But for those of you who've been enjoying this recorded, be sure to like and subscribe. And hopefully we'll be able to do this again with Bill in the future, as well as any new guests. So if you're watching this and would like to come on and chat, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But I am about out of words to say. I think we've certainly gone over our time. So again, thank you for tuning in. I'll be back later. But otherwise, have a great evening, everybody, and take care.